Chapter 13. Static Air. Genevieve. "What do you got there?"
Mr. Greeley asked, moving the beam of his flashlight toward me so that he could see what I was holding. For the past month since the outbreak, we'd been slowly working our way to the edges of Rochester. Our goal was to follow Lake Ontario to Fort Drum, where Mr. Greeley was hoping some of his old Army buddies, or at least some military personnel, would still be alive. There were 8 of us left in our small group, Mr. Greeley and I, 4 other men of different ages, a woman, and another girl a couple years older than me. Right now we were scavenging in an old grocery store, searching through the shelves that had already been picked clean by other survivors. Immediately after the outbreak, food and weapons had been stockpiled by anyone who could get their hands on some. And if you weren't one of those people, you were mostly out of luck now. I held up a small box of snack cake so Mr. Greeley could see it. The only reason I could see that it hadn't been accounted for yet was because it had fallen between 2 of the shelves, out of sight unless you purposefully looked there. Mr. Greeley gave me an approving grin and a pat on the back, and then continued past me to keep searching.
"You gonna share?"
asked a deep, playful voice from behind me. The tall blonde kid was pretty new. His name was Blake. We'd only found him a few days ago, but he was so charismatic and easygoing, it was hard for me not to already like him. Even though I already considered him a friend, with the loss of my dad and brother so fresh, it was hard to let it show. "Everybody shares everything," I answered flatly, as I put the box into my backpack. No matter what kinds of doleful answers I had for his questions the last few days, he continued to try and draw me out.
"Do you like the chocolate or the vanilla ones better?"
he asked, but before I could respond, he spoke again.
"Hold on, don't tell me."
He clasped his hands together and thoughtfully pressed his index finger to his lips.
"You look like a chocolate kind of girl."
He was wrong, but he looked so happy and excited about even guessing that I had to give him something. So I managed a small smile. "Vanilla," I corrected, and at his overly dramatized disappointment, I couldn't help but chuckle. I never really liked chocolate. Then as he started to follow me around the next empty aisle, I asked, "What about you?"
"Definitely chocolate," he told me. "I'm almost appalled at you."
"Most people are when they find that out," I replied, letting him see my amused smirk so he'd know I wasn't offended. As we turned down the next small aisle, the girl my age looked up at Blake and I. I could barely make her out, it was so dark, but I could tell that she was staring at us curiously. I'd seen her trying to get friendly with Blake since we'd found him. Blake noticed it too.
"Somebody's jealous,"
he sang playfully, quiet enough that she wouldn't hear. "Yeah," I chuckled, somewhat uncomfortably, seeing as I didn't want him to get the wrong impression.
"Oh,"
he added quickly, awkwardly.
"I'm not trying to flirt with you."
"I know," I told him instantly. I really hadn't known, but it was somewhat of a relief. The loss was too fresh for me to even feel anything but pain for too long. He was quiet for a few seconds, studying me through the dark.
"If you want me to, I can leave you alone."
He made an obvious pause and then added,
"Rebecca told me what happened."
Up until then, he'd actually been making me feel a little better, so I shook my head. "It's okay. It's kind of nice." I took a thoughtful moment and then shrugged. Mr. Greeley doesn't really know what to say to me most of the time. Makes it hard to forget. He nodded in understanding when he shined his light into the empty bag of chips.
"Do you want to forget?"
"No," I sighed softly. "I just don't want to miss them so much." Again, Blake nodded in understanding. It made me curious about him. "Did you have family?"
"Just my mom," he answered. "But she was off on one of her impromptu stays with her asshole boyfriend in Buffalo."
His voice trailed off. and he looked over at me like he wasn't sure if I'd be uncomfortable with him talking like that. "Aren't you worried?" I asked curiously. "Don't you think you should find her?" He turned one side of his mouth in a sad smile.
"I kind of already know. You know, I can feel it."
I mouthed the word "oh" and glanced away, unsure of how to offer any kind of comfort.
"I never knew my dad,"
he continued breezily.
"Word was he left my mom before I was born. My friends were my family. But you know how it was. Too chaotic in the city to really find anyone."
"I'm sorry," I offered remorsefully.
"Me too,"
he said with a grateful smile. Blake opened up his mouth again and had started to say something else, but he was cut off by a terrifyingly feral scream and someone yelling, "Oh shit, run!" I guess someone had ventured into the back freezer and opened it to find someone had stuffed a bunch of ferals in there. I was about to take off running down the aisle, but Blake grabbed me and pulled me down, clicking off his flashlight and then swiftly taking mine to do the same. Just as my beam disappeared, a few of our group members went sprinting past the aisle, followed by 3 ferals. Unfortunately, right after that, a few others from our group, including Mr. Greeley, turned down our aisle, and there were 6 ferals following them. "Okay, run," Blake said hastily, giving me a push toward the door. He didn't have to tell me twice. I took off running, hearing the thundering of footsteps behind me. I shot out the door of the grocery store and immediately turned left, glancing back just long enough to see that Blake, Mr. Greeley, and 3 other ferals were still on my trail. The next alley I passed, I turned down, praying there was a fire escape at the end of it. Blake followed me in, and as he did, I saw 3 figures go darting past the entrance of it. I knew Mr. Greeley hadn't followed us here because he'd led the ferals away, but one of them stopped because it caught sight of us, and it instantly flew into the alley. I reached the end and almost sighed with relief that there was a fire escape. When I got close enough, I jumped as high as I could into the air, but the ladder was pulled up, and I was too short to reach. Panic was the major emotion I was feeling, however, so I jumped again even though I knew it wouldn't work. But just as I jumped, Blake's hands landed on my waist, and he used my momentum to throw me high enough that my fingers clamped down over the lowest bar. I scrambled all the way up to the roof of the 2-story building before looking back and down to make sure that Blake could reach the ladder. My glance only told me that the feral had caught up before he could, and now he was wrestling with it. I was about to call out to him and rush back down to come to his aid, but before I could, something grabbed me by the shoulders and yanked me so hard backward, I went skidding across the rooftop I was on. As I came to a halt, I could see it was a man that had grabbed me, and there was another one standing at his side. I tried to dart up, thinking only of grabbing a steel baseball bat stuck in the straps of my backpack, but a third guy above my head put his hands on my shoulder and shoved me back. I wasn't sure where they'd come from, but they didn't look friendly. 2 of them had guns in their hands, and I was positive the man holding me down had one nearby.
"It's just a girl,"
one of them chuckled, the youngest one, in his mid-20s if the moonlight let me judge correctly. Then I heard a metallic ringing, like Blake had just grabbed a hold of the ladder. "Blake!" I shouted.
"If he comes up here, shoot him,"
the one holding me down hissed. I almost gasped with fresh panic. Blake didn't have a gun either. "Don't come up," I hollered to warn him. "They're 3. They'll shoot you." The man above me whacked his palm hard against the side of my head, managing to slap it flat against my ear. It had to have hurt more than if he'd punched me, and now the pressure against the side of my brain made it hard to even keep my eyes open. Then he flipped me over and began to wrench the backpack from off my shoulders. "No!" I protested, flopping onto my back and grabbing a tight hold of the bag before he could pull it away.
"Let go,"
he ordered, pulling so hard it lifted me a few inches off the ground. But I wasn't releasing my clutch on it. Everything I owned was in it, all I had left from my home. As the second man strode over, the third one released his hold on my bag and watched him to see what he'd do. The moment he got to the side, he pulled his foot back, and then he sent it crashing into my ribs. I hollered with agony and instinctively curled up, hugging the bag to my chest.
"Give him the bag,"
the youngest man begged from his spot a few feet away. When I offered no response, the third man kicked me in the back. After a cry of pain, I forced myself to ignore it and began trying to crawl toward the fire escape. I could deal with a feral better than I could deal with 3 grown men. The 2 guys let me crawl a couple of feet, striding along at my side. Then a heavy boot landed against my back, and when I shifted onto my back to protect it, another crashed again into my ribs.
"The bag,"
the third man demanded. At this point, I was in too much pain to do anything. I couldn't find the courage to refuse, but I couldn't find the strength to even unwrap my arms from it. The second man sighed in annoyance and folded his arms over his chest.
"Teach her a lesson."
Out of fear, I rolled onto my side and once more curled into a ball around my backpack. But the third man grabbed one of my shoulders to expose me as he knelt at my side. Once he had me on my back again, his fist smashed against my cheek. He managed to hit me 3 more times before, in my disoriented state, I thought to cover my face with my hands, thus releasing the bag. When I no longer had it in my grasp, the man stopped hitting me and stood, taking the bag with him. Like he thought I had the will to protest again, he kicked me in the ribs once more. As his foot was drawing away, there was the faintest ring of movement against the ladder.
"Let's go,"
he said, and he and the youngest one immediately ran to the opposite edge of the roof and jumped across to the next one close by. My eyes were so blurred with agonizing tears, and my head was so woozy that I could barely tell the second man was just staring at me. I almost thought I was just imagining it, until he pulled his foot back further than either of them had yet, and he kicked me one last time. He was gone with the other 2 and my backpack by the time someone came up the ladder. All I could do was lie there. I couldn't look up to see who'd come to my rescue, because I could hardly even breathe. It wasn't even until now that I felt the salty tears streaming down my cheeks. They stung the open wounds on my face, and every time I sobbed, it caused an excruciating pain in my abdomen. A moment later, I heard Mr. Greeley's voice bark,
"Check on her,"
and then Blake was at my side.
"Genevieve."
He gently shook my shoulders.
"Oh my God,"
he mumbled, and I could tell he was panicked, because he started babbling.
"I'm so sorry it took me so long. You said they shoot me, and so I went to find Mr. Greeley."
One of his arms slipped carefully under my neck, while his other went beneath my knees, and he scooped me up and carried me to the side of the roof. Once there, he delicately set me down, leaning my back against the ledge of the roof. But it hurt so bad to sit up that after he let me go, I slumped over onto my side.
"Mr. Greeley!"
Blake hollered frantically, and while my eyes were closed, I could hear footsteps rush over. Mr. Greeley dropped at my side and put his hand in mine.
"Squeeze my hand if you can hear me,"
he instructed, sounding just as panicked as Blake did. But I didn't have the strength to squeeze his hand, so I let out a groan instead.
"I'm so sorry,"
Blake whispered, but in my fading consciousness he sounded so far away.
"I'll never leave you again, I promise." "Hold your light on her,"
Mr. Greeley instructed, and whatever he said next was lost in the darkness. "What does this mean?" I asked Echo, pointing one finger straight up in the air and making a deliberate circle with my hand. She looked up from her breakfast to watch, and now she was squinting one eye at me thoughtfully.
"That's, a rally point."
I nodded my consent at her answer, even though I knew she'd remember what it meant. Since the special assignment, I'd been making sure that she learned all the hand and light signals we used on mission. It was where the nerd I used to know shined, because she had impeccable memory, and managed to learn all of them within a matter of days. It had been a little over a week now, but I still asked her randomly from time to time, just to make sure that the information was sticking.
"Morning, ladies."
Blake's voice came from behind me, and for some reason Echo raised a surprised eyebrow at him. Curious, I turned before he got a chance to sit down. Casey was with him, and while he had his plate of food in one hand, it looked like he had just let go of Casey with his other.
"A room for us?"
Knock yourself out, I consented, motioning for Echo to come and sit over by me. I wanted Blake and Casey to sit across from me. That way I could see if there was something going on, and possibly make fun of Blake for it. Hi, Genevieve, Casey said with a shy smile as she and Blake moved around to sit across from me. Then she smiled at the raider. Echo. I gave Blake a smug grin as he sat, only to have him scowl at me because he knew I was going to tease him. It looked like he was about to mouth a warning, too, but then Echo plopped down next to me. It's what I'd told her to do, but I couldn't keep my eyes from wandering to her when she did. Because she'd sat down so close, the warmth of her body made me realize how chilly the morning breeze was. There was at least 3 feet of empty bench that could separate us, so when she realized I was staring at her awkwardly, she gave an apologetic smile and scooted away. What are you crazy kids up to? I asked playfully, turning my gaze back on Blake and Casey. Then when the cold seeped back in to where the warmth was now missing, I shivered. Nothing, Blake answered, too nonchalantly, and I couldn't help but smirk. Maybe I shouldn't be trying to tease him, but he'd been so adamant about not wanting to have a girlfriend that I couldn't let the opportunity pass by. You have any plans for today? I said, looking at Casey, because I knew I'd get more of an answer out of her. Though my tone and smile were teasingly amused, I found it cute that she was leaning into Blake so contentedly that she was practically sitting on his lap. He deserved to be happy, even if I was gonna bug him about it. I'm covering for April while she's at the place in the woods, Casey answered, her green eyes lighting up with a gleeful grin. So Blake wanted to help me in the medical cabin today. He did? I asked in playful disbelief, giving Blake a mischievous, beaming smile. He glared at me from behind his water cup, and taking a deliberate look inside of it, he mused hopefully. I'm out of water. After that, he gave a brief look around, and a moment later Casey stood happily. I'll get you some. The second she walked away with his empty cup, he leaned over the table toward me. Don't make it a thing, he said. It's no big deal. Were you guys holding hands? I asked jauntingly, but kept my voice at a whisper to keep from embarrassing him too much. Genevieve, he whined pleadingly. Don't make more of this than it is. I couldn't help but giggle at how he was blushing. He was starting to like her. He never got shy like this. What is it exactly? Nothing, he answered, chuckling timidly. I was pretty snuggly for nothing. Echo chimed in and nodded in acknowledgement when I gave her a grateful smile for backing me up. You like her, I continued, hardly holding back entertained laughter. Admit it. Stop it, he glared, poorly containing his smile. Admit it, I repeated, reaching across the table and playfully pinching his cheeks. Come on, lover boy, Echo giggled encouragingly. Fine, he said, and after suspiciously glancing around and seeing that Casey was on her way back, he whispered swiftly, I sort of like her. At his confession, both Echo and I made a show of triumph, and in my joy at Blake's potential love affair, I even gave her a high five. You guys are evil, he grumbled, and as Casey sat back down with his cup, he smiled at her appreciatively. Thank you. So, what are you guys doing today? Casey asked before taking a bite of her breakfast. I was gonna ask her, I answered, nodding toward Echo. We've got night patrol, so we might take the day off. Occasionally, Echo complained that I never took days off. It hadn't really occurred to me that I never did until she came along. Mostly it was because I worried people might think I was lazy, even if my main job was being a soldier. Just because it was dangerous didn't mean it was hard, and there was always work to do around camp. It didn't seem like Echo had lived a pampered life with the Raiders, but it definitely seemed like most days weren't filled with labor. So I decided when we had night patrols, I'd give her the option to take the day off. That way I wouldn't have to hear her complain about it too much. Echo's lips instantly curled into a smile, and she turned to face me enthusiastically. Can we go to the river? I tried to hide my satisfaction at the suggestion, since I didn't want her to mistake my liking her idea for me liking her. Instead, I gave a small shrug. Sure. Honestly, going to the river was probably one of the best ideas she'd had since she'd got here. It would be winter soon, and the water was already starting to get too cold to bathe in. Might as well go for one of our last dips before we had to start heating water near the tent every time we wanted to wash up. Can we go now? She asked happily, standing before I could even respond. I peered into my coffee cup, and even though the remaining drip wasn't enough to sip, I tilted it toward my lips one last time. I have to meet Kat first, I told her, and as I looked at Blake, I nodded toward Echo again. Can you guys watch her for a few minutes? He shrugged unconcernedly, and with a grateful smile, I started toward the meeting tent.
Genevieve?
Cap's gruff voice carried to me as I was about to enter the tent, and I backed up to see him jogging my way. For one thing, Cap never hurried, and I also couldn't read the look he had on his face. What's up? I asked curiously, following him in when he continued past me.
I was with April at the cabin,
he answered, and upon reaching the table inside, he pulled his revolver out of the holster around his waist.
There was an accident last night.
When he pulled the box of ammunition out of the footlocker on the ground, a little part of me panicked. What happened? Is she okay? He looked up at me, seemingly confused about why I sounded so worried. Then he chuckled, scratching his beard like he was embarrassed he'd scared me.
Sorry. The two were unrelated.
Then he held up his revolver as if to explain why'd he use ammunition.
We put the feral down. The tetanus vaccine was unsuccessful.
I practically sighed with relief, dropping myself into the chair across the table from him. What happened last night? Cap replaced the revolver at his side and took a seat.
The patrols found 3 ferals wandering in the woods.
My eyes widened in shock, and before I could even ask, he answered my question.
No one was hurt, luckily, but let your guys know. Make sure they aren't slacking off or falling asleep during their shifts. I might also add more foot patrols to the shifts, at least for a couple of weeks.
Sounds good, I nodded in understanding, but there was a sinking feeling in my gut. We'd never had an issue like this before. Our camp was safe, isolated, out of the feral's reach. Do you think it'll happen again? He looked at me for a minute while he thought about it, and then gave a soft shrug.
Let's hope it doesn't.
We were both quiet for a little bit. I wanted to go patrol right now, but even if it was the first time that this had happened, I felt the need to protect the camp. But I had a shift tonight, and there was no way I could patrol 24 hours every day, no matter how badly I wanted to.
How's Echo adjusting?
Cap asked eventually. Fine, I mumbled hesitantly. Cap was someone I definitely didn't want to talk to about Echo. I still blamed him for putting me in this position.
You're still mad,
he observed. I wanted to brush it off and leave so we didn't have to talk about it. But a part of me wanted to complain to him so that he'd know how hard it was on me. It's just, I paused, debating whether or not I should gripe. There are so many other soldiers here that...
Do you know why I put you in charge of her?
He interrupted, knowing where I was going with my complaint. I shook my head.
Out of everyone here, you have the most reasons to hate her. Not just raiders in general, like everyone else does, but her, specifically.
I knew that much. That's why I didn't want to be in charge of her. And the fact that he was acknowledging it only made me frustrated. And why? I asked impatiently.
It's obvious that you want her to fail,
he answered, absent-mindedly adjusting his green trucker hat as he glanced away.
And because you want it so badly, I know that when you start to trust her, I can too.
I'll never trust her, Cap, I told him bitterly. If that was his whole reasoning behind it, then I felt used. She's dangerous. He was studying me again, like he was trying to figure out what to say. I almost thought I'd convinced him of Echo's unreliability, until he said,
I noticed you gave her knife back.
I opened my mouth to form a response, but I couldn't really think of how to argue that.
I never found fault in your decision-making. Should I start now?
No, I grumbled indignantly. I didn't like this. The way that he was twisting my logic. The way he was pointing out that even against my will, I was beginning to trust her.
I want you to start giving her some freedom,
he said, before I could come up with some other arguments against Echo.
Just a little, an hour or two a week, and only during the day. See what she does with it.
I just stared at the rooftop, completely dissatisfied with the turn of the conversation. We done? I asked flatly.
I'm sorry it has to be this way,
he said sincerely.
I'm sorry for what you lost, but I'm a man of my word, Jen, and I think that's even more important now that the world's gone to shit.
I wanted to tell him that he shouldn't have made that deal with Echo in the first place. But as much as I wanted it to be the wrong decision, it got Blake back. No matter how much I hated Echo, I'd let Kat make it again if it would save another life. That still didn't mean I had to be happy about it. When I just sat there, staring back instead of answering him, because there was nothing I could say, he nodded with a sigh.
We're done.
I gave an awkward pursing of my lips in parting, and then walked out of the exit back toward the DFAC. Despite my annoyance at Cap's wanting to discuss what discussing wouldn't change, I wasn't as frustrated about it now that I wasn't in his presence. Part of me was too confused about when I'd started to trust Echo enough to give her the knife. I knew I had given it to her in the first place, but I never would have done it if I thought that she'd do something dangerous with it. She was constantly getting into fights with me, admittedly more often because I was picking them. But even though she was violent, I didn't feel like she was deadly. If she wanted to kill me, she'd already had plenty of opportunities, and she was never aggressive towards anyone else. Is it normal to trust someone you hate? I didn't have an answer, and my mind was already exhausted enough that I just wanted to let it go. Plus, giving Echo a couple of hours of freedom was a couple much-needed free hours of my own. As I got close to the dining area, it looked like my three companions were having a good laugh about something. But when I arrived, they stopped, and Blake looked at me awkwardly, like he thought I'd be upset he was having fun with Echo. I didn't mind so much, and gave him a small smile to let him know it was okay. Maybe it was because I was so happy for him having a crush on Casey that I was still in a decent mood, or it was the prospect of those freedom hours. Thanks, guys, I said to Blake and Casey, and then glanced at Echo. You ready? She immediately stood to follow me to the tent and grab our bathing stuff. As we were coming out again with our items in hand, Kellen was passing by, and he grinned the moment he saw me.
Oh, Genevieve,
he sighed infatuatedly, his lips gaining their infamously flirtatious curve.
40,000 men, with all their love, couldn't make up my sum.
I rolled my eyes, though I still couldn't help but chuckle at his continuously useless attempts. Even if I was never going to sleep with him, it was still flattering. Until Echo scoffed, rolling her eyes not nearly as friendly as I did.
You're not serious,
she said, raising a disbelieving eyebrow at him before glancing at me. When I gave her an impatiently curious look, she rolled her eyes again.
That's Shakespeare, you idiot. Jesus, does anyone except for this dimwit read?
I shook my head again, because it hadn't sounded familiar to me. Hamlet? She repeated the quote in a hurried murmur.
40,000 brothers could not, with all their quantity of love, make up my sum.
And then she turned to Kellen.
Seriously, if you're gonna hit on a girl, don't use some cliche bullshit like Shakespeare. What do you know about hitting on girls?
He retorted defensively. Echo chuckled, laugh line deepening with amusement.
More than you, apparently.
After that, she turned to me. staring deeply into my eyes.
If I give you my heart, would you cherish it?
I opened my mouth to tell her that was the stupidest pickup line I'd ever heard. But the moment I did, she pressed her finger to my lips and put her other hand to her heart so dramatically I nearly snorted with laughter.
It doesn't matter. Take it or break it. It's no longer mine to decide.
She was obviously making fun of Kellen, and since I hated her, I was trying so hard not to laugh. I'm gonna say the winner is... I started, failing to wipe the entertained smile off my face. Shakespeare.
You're so full of crap.
Echo chuckled, shaking her head and walking away to start in the direction of the river. Now I didn't know what to say to Kellen. To be honest, I felt kind of bad for him. In recompense, I gave him a coy smile and a pat on his chest. Better luck next time. And then I hurried after Echo. You didn't have to embarrass him, I said, catching up as we reached the edge of the stream.
Please,
she responded sarcastically, and she kicked off her already untied boots while pulling her shirt over her head.
With a line like that, he deserved it.
I undid my own laces and then began to strip, folding my clothing articles on top of my boots. Yours was even cheesier than his.
I wasn't serious.
She strode into the water, taking in a pained breath at the temperature once it reached her waist.
I would never hit on a girl with a pickup line.
Then what would you hit on a girl with? I asked teasingly, pointing out how entirely gay it sounded when she said that. Her only response was to make a mocking face at me.
Besides, he wasn't serious either.
Echo was silent for a few seconds, and then,
oh God.
She dipped her head underwater, and when she came back up, she cleared her eyes and cocked her head at me scoldingly.
Please tell me you haven't slept with him.
I narrowed my eyes at her, because it really wasn't any of her business. But for some reason, I didn't want her to think that I was that easy. He wouldn't be after me so desperately if I had.
Phew,
she said, pretending to wipe sweat from her forehead. Why do you dislike him so much? I asked, half curious, half offended that she felt so strongly about it. My good mood was disappearing.
Aside from the fact that he's disgusting,
she replied, absent-mindedly working her bar of soap into suds. She was starting to aggravate me again. He's a nice guy, I told her fiercely. Plus, he was too attractive to be disgusting. Her eyebrows furrowed in confusion.
By whose standards?
Anyone's, I answered shortly. Echo started massaging the suds into her hair, talking in a way that made her seem so much calmer about this than I was.
Not mine.
As a murderer, you're biased, I said, crossing my arms over my chest. I knew she hated it when I called her that, and I got something of a reaction when she dropped her hands from her head and glared at me, grinding her teeth furiously. But it was so obvious she knew why I'd said it, because she tried to regain some composure.
Fine, she said apathetically. And just go fuck him already.
You're so irritating, I shouted, splashing water at her because she was too far away for me to throw a punch. Instead of saying anything, she looked at me while she ducked her head underwater again, calmly rinsing the soap from her hair. She wasn't going to say anything. I knew it because she usually had one of two reactions when we got into a fight. She was coldly collected, like now, or she went completely nuclear. The coldly collected response was somewhat new, and started when she realized how much it pissed me off. I wanted so badly to provoke her, to make her so angry that she'd lash out and make it acceptable for me to hit her. Especially being as annoyed as I was right now. Every time I looked at her, there was a stinging pain in my chest, a heartbreaking reminder of what she took from me, and most of the time I wanted to hurt her back. But when she was in calm moods like this, she was determined, and it was impossible to lure her into a fight. What made it infinitely more frustrating was that I couldn't find an outlet for my anger, and most of the time I couldn't walk away so that she couldn't see how much she got to me. By the time she resurfaced, I turned away. Now I was taking deep breaths, focusing on scrubbing every bit of dirt off of my body in an attempt to forget about my rage. But what made these situations still more frustrating was that I never used to lose my temper like this. Not until she arrived did I turn into an emotional time bomb. She brought out the worst in me, and I hated that. One thing I couldn't complain about when Echo went into these silent Zen states was that they lasted a while. She didn't say another word to me until I'd finished a peaceful nap after we returned from the river. She stayed in the tent while I hung out with Blake outside of the campfire. She even remained silent the entire time we ate dinner, which was completely shocking, since I'd realized mealtime was an especially talkative time for her. Before I knew it, we were sitting in the patrol tower, keeping a close watch out for any ferals.
"You got a quote for when they come around again?"
Echo asked, her voice carrying across to me through the dark. I could see her silhouette leaning over the railing of the blind as she held the night vision binoculars to her eyes. "No," I answered softly. She'd been so silent the entire time that with my head leaned back against the wood rail, I'd almost dozed off. "You?"
"I was thinking,"
she said, and then she told me the quote.
"I just know that every man I kill, the further away from home I feel."
Even though she couldn't see it, I squinted thoughtfully. It wasn't just the way she said it, like it meant something to her. I also felt like I'd heard it before. Why does that sound familiar?
"It's from Saving Private Ryan,"
her voice replied.
"We watched it in history. You remember? With Mr. Grant."
Oh yeah. I could recall it now, watching the movie in class. It felt like a lifetime ago. More than that, it was like one of those stories you only hear about your childhood from other people. And after a while, you've heard it so many times that you aren't sure whether you can just imagine it perfectly or if it's a real memory. That's what it felt like. Like back then might not even be real. But a moment later, Echo chuckled, and I quit pondering how things used to be. "What?"
"Mr. Grant,"
she answered, snickering to herself again.
"How he used to try and convince us to go to Civil War reenactments for extra credit."
I couldn't help but giggle, and quoted in the deepest voice I could.
"If you come, I'll be the guy on horseback wearing blue, riding in to save the day."
"Oh my God," Echo snorted with laughter.
"You sound exactly like him."
It felt so good to laugh that I didn't want it to stop.
"Students, shut your pie holes,"
I continued in the same deep, monotonous voice.
"History is the jewel of civilization. You should take pride in your nation."
I couldn't remember Mr. Grant saying those exact words, but it sounded like something he'd say. And in the dark, I could see Echo was buckled over because she was laughing so hard. It didn't really make sense, but even though I still hated her, knowing what she was didn't hurt so bad when I couldn't see her. There was no sting of heartbreak, no feeling of betrayal, just a chronic dissatisfaction that flared up when she said something that specifically reminded me of who she was. That was probably another part of the problem, who she was, instead of who she used to be. Because I really liked who she used to be. And sometimes I'd catch the slightest glimpse, and even if it was just for a second, it was enough to confuse my hatred.
"What did you want to be?"
Echo asked, her laughter tapering off into recovery breaths.
"Before the outbreak, as a career?"
"Well, if I didn't make a pro soccer team," I started, and heard her for me to continue. "I always thought I'd like to be FBI or CIA or something like that."
Makes sense,
she mused.
since you like being a soldier so much.
I like helping people, I told her with a slight shrug. Call me high speed, but the normal routes like doctor or therapist just seem so boring. At that, I heard her chuckle. What about you? She was quiet for a few seconds, and then she sounded kind of unsure.
I don't know. Nothing ever really called to me. Maybe a librarian or a teacher, if I can never decide.
It was hard to picture Echo, the raider, being a librarian. And just like that, with the reminder that she was the raider, I didn't feel like laughing anymore. A librarian who can pick locks and fight well enough that you'd probably give Blake a good beatdown. I could tell by the tone of her response that she'd picked up on the change in my mood. She always knew what I was feeling, even when she couldn't see me.
The things I know,
she said, her voice dolefully and cautiously soft.
The things I can do. That's what it took to survive in the city.
She paused and reluctantly added a moment later.
With the raiders.
Whatever helps you sleep at night, I replied sarcastically, ready for her to stop talking or change the subject before I started getting severely irritated again. Echo gave a delicate sigh before telling me quietly,
It doesn't.
I didn't respond, partly because I didn't care how she felt about the things that she'd done, and partly because I didn't want to talk to her anymore. But after a minute of silence, it bothered me. That feeling of betrayal. Maybe she didn't know my little brother was in that school, but I still expected so much more from her than falling in with the raiders. She was the last person I would have ever expected it from, and I never felt so let down. You know, I thought about you, I told her bitterly, after the outbreak. She didn't say anything, but I knew that by her silence she was listening. Maybe because I was always watching out for you, but you were the first person that I thought of when I started wondering where all my friends could be. She was still listening quietly, letting me say what I wanted, even though my tone was anything but pleasant. Can you believe it? I was kind of worried. Then the elementary school, and I just wanted you to drop dead. I wasn't talking to her so much now as I was talking to myself, thinking out loud. Always the prey, I mused. Now you're just the predator. She sighed once more, and I could tell in the thick tension between us that she wanted to argue it, but she didn't. And she was quiet for a couple of minutes before she spoke again.
Can I ask you something?
You're gonna ask me anyway, I consented grumpily.
Before the outbreak, at school,
she said, and in the dark I could see her turn to face me.
Why were you so nice to me?
I didn't answer at first, because the question reminded me of who she used to be. It was like flipping a switch. That's how easily she affected my moods, how easily she affected my opinion of her. All she had to do was bring up something like this, and I wasn't talking to the raider anymore. Do you remember in 4th grade, some kid stole a bracelet out of my pencil box, and you told me about it? She replied in the affirmative. It belonged to my mom. It was one of her favorite things, and my dad gave it to me when she died.
That's it?
She sounded genuinely surprised.
That's all I did?
It meant the whole world to me, I whispered sincerely, because for some reason, I wanted her to know she had an impact. She didn't seem to know how to respond to that. Probably because I hadn't really said a single, even remotely heartfelt thing to her since she had gotten here.
I'm sorry about your mom. And what happened to her?
The flipping of a switch. Some of my immediate reaction was hearing her say that goddamn word, sorry, again. The other part was the actual reminder of what happened to my mother. Because even if it wasn't Echo's fault, my mind made a connection. None of your business, I told her scathingly.
Okay, jeez,
she whispered in defensive shock.
You don't have to be so hostile.
Hostile? The murderer was complaining about me being hostile? Why don't you tell me what happened to your family? Even though I knew it was one of those topics that made her nuclear, I said it anyway.
Forget it.
Her voice immediately gained an aggravated edge, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. No, come on, I urged, getting more and more annoyed by the second that she wanted me to talk about things when she was just going to clam up. I know you had one, your parents. And I tried to think back all those years. And 2 sisters, right? They were at our middle school graduation.
You share your story, I'll share mine,
she said savagely. I ignored her, keeping with my own nagging to finally get a reaction out of her. What did you do, huh? You sacrificed them to the raiders? Is that why you sound so guilty every time you bring it up?
Stop,
she shouted suddenly, and I heard the palm of her hand slap hard against the floor of the tower, while the boom in her voice echoed through the silent night. When things quieted down again, she sniffled, but there was still fury mixed in with the fresh anguish.
You don't know the first fucking thing about my guilt.
I wanted to keep picking at her, because not even the night could mask my hurt now, and I'd finally gotten a reaction. But sitting there in the dark, not knowing whether she was more furious or sad, I couldn't predict the next reaction, and I was a little bit afraid. Not of her trying to hurt me. I had my rifle, while all she had was a pocket knife. I was sort of afraid of finding out. Either she did something terrible, or something terrible happened to her. Either way, I was nervous to know what kind of effect that information would have on my feelings towards her.
If I ever try to explain myself,
Echo eventually said in a whisper,
would you hear me? Without judgment?
No, I thought. If you say one more word to me, I will physically throw you out of this tower. She didn't say another word to me for the rest of the night. Chapter 14. I don't want to play. Echo.
I stood up to leave the small house our group was staying at now, passing between the kitchen and the living room to get to the front door. For the past hour, I'd been resting in a nearby room, waiting for Victor to leave the main area so he wouldn't see me go out. Now I couldn't wait any longer, and decided that I needed to make a break for it. I'd barely reached for the handle when he stopped me. Echo. He called from the fold-up table, where he was playing poker with some of the guys. Where are you going? Out, I answered impatiently, already itching to get to where I was going. In my aggravated mindlessness, I almost scratched at my wrist, where there was a freshly healing tattoo, but I caught myself right on time, grateful to have avoided the pain that would have resulted in my itching it. He waved to try and coax me over. Come here, play with us. I'm gonna scavenge, Victor, I told him, glancing from him to the other guys at the table, and then to the cups of alcohol in front of them. Let me go with you, he said, standing up slowly so he wouldn't tip over. You're drunk. I was practically tapping my foot because I was so ready to get out of the house. I was already running late. Stay here. Yeah, stay here, Victor, another guy named Martin said. She might be 18 now, but she's still never gonna fuck you. Victor turned to flip Martin the finger, and before he could swivel around to address me again, I was out of the door. Just in case he decided to try and come after me, I jogged away from the house, making sure to stick to the shadows in case there were any random biters wandering around. My destination wasn't far, but even though I was running late, I eventually slowed down, not wanting to make a mistake if it could mean the difference between life and death. Before long, the housing tract I was heading for came into view, and I crept through the dark into the fenced backyard of my destination home. "Valerie," I whispered, tiptoeing through the long grass near the wall of the house, and trying not to make too much noise. I was about to call for her again, when I felt something poke into my ribs. It scared me enough that I jumped, and when I spun around, Valerie had her hands over her mouth to keep from laughing too loudly. "Jesus, Val," I complained lightheartedly, through a laugh of my own, while I set my hands on her hips, and then I pulled her backward with me until my shoulders met the wall. Her eager lips were on mine the second my back touched the house, but she pulled away a moment later to nag teasingly, "You're late." We always met somewhere in secret when we got together. Leon had taught me how to fight, and I could defend myself against any of the guys if they found out and decided to harass me about it. But Valerie still insisted on sneaking away. She didn't want it being any harder on me with the group than it already was. Sometimes I just wished I could make it easier on her. "I'm so sorry," I said, giving her an apologetic peck and feeling my excitement escalate when her bare hands connected with my stomach. I was trying to avoid Victor. He didn't want to let me leave. "He's a dick." Her mouth met mine again, and through the side of my lips I whispered knowingly, "You're telling me." Valerie's hands didn't hesitate to set to work on the button of my pants, and even though her lips tried to leave mine so that she could reply, I followed her, reluctant for it to end even for a second. "I hate the way he looks at you." "I know." I stopped trying to catch her mouth and pulled away to study her, to see the dislike on her face. I tried to be comforting by fondly pushing her hair behind her ear, and after running my thumb over her cheek, I gave her a deep, long kiss. "But you don't have to worry about me," I assured in a hushed murmur. "I used to," she told me, looking me seriously in the eyes. But a moment later she shook her head, as if to ward off the tone our conversation had taken. Then without warning, she slipped her hand between my legs, and when I let out a satisfied whimper, she grinned. She scolded, clearly amused as she tried to wipe the grin off her face. "There could be biters around, not a peep." I chuckled against her lips, and she kissed me again, and I attempted to ignore the bliss of her touch, while I turned us around and pressed her against the wall. "Let's see you stay quiet, then," I challenged playfully, dropping my mouth to her neck while my own hand wandered below her waist. I'd barely started when she pulled my mouth away from her neck to bring it back to her own. "God, Echo, you're getting too good at that," she whispered euphorically, leaning her head back after hardly a second, like she couldn't decide whether she wanted to kiss me or just let me work. I smirked, planting a peck on her cheek and running my other hand up to her chest. "Which part?" "All of it," she breathed, and the last half of it escaping through a soft moan. I told her with a coy smile. "Not a peep, remember?" She nodded without protest and wrapped her arms tight around my neck so that she could kiss me without stopping. This was so much better than being stuck in the house. The chill of dawn caused me to shiver, and in my sleeping state I panicked, thinking Genevieve was already awake and would catch me without my handcuffs on. I almost shot up into a sitting position, but even through the panic, I managed to stay calm, cracking one eye in the dim gray to look over at her. She was still fast asleep, so as quietly as I could, I refastened one of my wrists to the corner of my cot. I was glad I'd woken when I did, because I'd hardly cuffed myself back in when she turned onto her side, facing me. I could tell her eyes were barely open, looking at me, so I gave an innocent smile.
Why the hell are you awake? She grumbled, rolling onto her stomach and covering her head with her pillow.
You were talking in your sleep, I told her seriously. She lifted her head just enough to focus on me.
I was?
Yeah, I nodded, and then added playfully. You were talking about how bad you wanted to let me out of these handcuffs.
Shut up,
she said, and she almost laughed as she threw her pillow at me.
Go back to sleep.
The way she was acting right now, how she seemed to be in a good mood so far this morning, it made me smile. I wanted to keep messing with her so that she'd keep being friendly with me.
Echo,
I groaned, making stuff up as I pretended to imitate Genevieve, tossing and turning as if I couldn't sleep. She's uncomfortable. I should let her out. But I was making my voice more annoying than she really sounded, and I could hear her give an amused chuckle. She hates those cuffs. How she dreads them so. Even though her lips had the slightest curve of that crookedly modest smile, she rolled her eyes and turned onto her back to ignore me.
I can't hear you.
I threw the pillow back at her, hitting her in the side of the head with it. Can you hear me now?
No,
she answered, putting the pillow back under her head. While I was messing with her, the handcuffs were already starting to get uncomfortable. I really did hate them. So I sat up, trying to maintain some level of playfulness, so Genevieve wouldn't get mad about my ceaseless attempts to get her to take them off. Close your eyes, I told her, while I sat up. Then I stood up, and the tent was just small enough that, with one hand still cuffed to my cot, I could stretch all the way to Genevieve's. You're getting sleepy, I crooned, peeling back the edge of her sleeping bag and reaching my free hand toward the pocket of her jeans. She hadn't closed her eyes, and she was watching me like she wasn't sure whether or not I was really going to try and grab the key from her, or whether or not she should be mad about it. I barely got the tip of my index finger into her pocket before she smacked my hand away.
Do you have any idea how annoying you are?
Annoying enough for you to take these off? I asked with a hopeful grin, backing up until I was sitting on my bed.
Good God, I need coffee,
she sighed, pushing herself up and digging the key out of her pants. After she tossed it to me, she slipped into her boots, and when she got off the cot, she shivered, making me aware of how cold it was this morning.
I'm gonna see if Cap is awake yet. Find out if he needs anything,
she told me, while she put on her gray hoodie. I copied her, pulling my own black sweater over my head. Okay, I shrugged compliantly. I'll just sit in the corner like usual.
No, she said thoughtfully. You can stay here.
My eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Should I wake up Blake or something? I asked unsuredly, since whenever Genevieve wasn't watching me, she usually left me with him.
Do what you want,
she answered, like she was completely unconcerned about it, casually throwing her rifle over her shoulder and turning toward the exit of the tent.
I'll come back to get you in an hour. Just be back by then.
Is this a test? I hesitantly called after her as she left, wondering if I should really go and wake Blake anyway. She either didn't answer or didn't hear me. So I stood there, staring at the flap door. Well, color me confused, I mumbled, glancing around the tent uncertainly. I felt awkward standing here by myself. It had been at least 2 months now since I'd been at this camp, and not once had I been left alone, nor had I really been left to judge for myself what would occupy my time. Now I had a whole entire hour to fill, and I had no idea what to do with it. Part of me still wanted to go and wake Blake up. It wasn't just that I was scared I might do something Genevieve found unsatisfactory if I was left alone. I didn't know what to do with myself. I'll be damned. My first minutes alone, and I was worried about being bored. A small chuckle escaped my throat when I realized how ridiculous that was. Without another thought, I strode happily out the exit, determined to do anything other than just sit in or right outside of the tent. There really wasn't much to do, though. It didn't make sense to try and find a job to do since I only had an hour. Some of the civilians were still sleeping, and the ones who were awake were either eating breakfast or already working at their jobs. The only thing I could really think to do was walk around, which was probably as boring as if I just sat back at the tent, seeing as I already knew the layout of the camp and there wasn't much to explore. So far, this first hour of strangely given freedom was a waste. After eating breakfast, I wandered around aimlessly for what felt like 20 minutes before I decided I might as well wait for Genevieve by the tent. I was on my way back when, as I passed by a man's campsite, he said hi to me. The layout of his site was pretty simple. A slanted tarp served as the roof of his small shelter, covering his cot and a few bins of things. Since I didn't know him, I gave a smile in return and kept heading in the direction of Genevieve's tent. "You're kind of new, right?" the man asked before I could get too far away. "Yeah," I answered hesitantly, backtracking a little bit to be polite. He looked to be in his late 40s, with close-cropped black hair and dark brown eyes. He was kind of scrawny, hardly taller than I was, and it didn't appear that he was one of the hard labor workers around camp. "I've been trying to keep acquainted with all the people here," he explained, putting on an invitingly friendly smile as I made my way closer. "I'm Anthony." Echo. I introduced myself. It wasn't until I was practically standing right in front of him to shake his hand that I noticed a small gold cross hanging around his neck, and a stealthy glance behind him revealed a worn Bible sitting on his cot. "What do you do around here?" I asked. "I'm a teacher for the grade school children," he answered, and a moment later he confirmed my suspicion. "And once a week I do a sermon for whoever wants to listen." "Uh-huh," I mumbled uncomfortably, taking a step away and thinking he might damn me to hell if he found out who I was. "I'm probably the last person you want to talk to." "I know who you are," he said before I could hurry away. "You're a bit infamous around here." "Great," I thought sarcastically. If he knew who I was, then he was probably talking to me to go on some Save the Raider crusade. "No offense, sir," I started as politely as I could, "but I'm really not looking for religion." "I was just saying hi," he chuckled amusedly. But it was clear he knew he'd freaked me out, so he gave a small wave. "It was nice to meet you, Echo." I felt awkward enough that I was just going to walk away, but then I caught a glimpse into one of the plastic bins under his tarp. It was full of books. It had been so long since I'd read a book. He followed my gaze, and his lips turned up in a happy smile. "You like to read?" Anthony motioned for me to follow him as he made his way to the bin. And when he removed the lid, the delightful smell of musty paperbacks flooded my nostrils. "Love to read," I corrected, mesmerized by the sight and smell. One of the novels on the very top I'd already read, but it looked like it was filled with ones I hadn't. "Would you like to borrow one?" he asked. "My students are a little young for these." "Are you sure?" Sometimes, what with being a soldier now and this seemingly endless apocalypse, it felt like I'd never hold a book again in my entire life. "Absolutely." He motioned toward the bin again and let me know I should pick one. I reached for a random book, determined to go through every one in there. "Thank you so much," I told him gratefully. He nodded, following me to the edge of his campsite. "When you're finished, if you want to come and get another, don't worry about if I'm here or not." I couldn't help but grin. This was a dream come true. "Thanks," I repeated, and gave him an appreciative handshake before starting once more to Genevieve's tent. Blake was awake now, though while he sat outside at the campfire, it looked like he was barely awake. His eyes were half closed, and he was staring so tiredly, he didn't even see me pass by to put the book in the tent. After I set it onto my cot, I made my way back out, and he looked a little surprised when I dropped down onto the log, perpendicular to his. "Morning," I greeted, chuckling when his only response was to nod and then go back to staring at the fire. A moment later, he glanced around. "Where's Genevieve?" I shrugged, knowing meetings with Cap never took an hour, but not really knowing if she'd had some other tasks she didn't want to tell me about. "She left me alone. Said she'd meet me back here in a while." He nodded knowingly, shivering against the morning and shoving his hands into the front pockets of his jacket. "She finally gave you that hour of freedom." "I don't know why she did," I told him in confusion, since the way Blake said it made it sound like she'd been planning to. He pulled one hand out of his jacket to rub his sleep-heavy eyes. "I think it was Cap's idea." I knew it was a test. I mumbled. Of course they wouldn't leave me alone because they trusted me. That would mean Genevieve was starting to like me, and we all knew that would never happen. "Did you enjoy it at least?" Blake asked. "I was actually kind of bored," I told him honestly, and he mirrored my entertained laugh. After a moment, I told him more seriously. "Genevieve's kind of like the center of my life now. I don't really know what to do with myself if she doesn't tell me." "You'll figure it out when they start giving you more time alone," he said with a light shrug. "Find a rhythm or something." When I didn't respond to him, just offered the smallest of nods, he raised an eyebrow at me. "You don't want the freedom?" "I don't know." I stared at the fire for a thoughtful minute, trying to figure out why he was right. Why I couldn't decide what to do with myself for the last hour. I want the trust that comes with it. But the thing I want most is for Genevieve to forgive me. Doesn't seem like I can get it if she's never around. The only thing keeping me around her in the first place was Cap's instruction, and I knew that. If it weren't for him, Genevieve would want absolutely nothing to do with me. Blake nodded in understanding, and we were both quiet for a bit before I thought of something else. "Can I ask you a question about Genevieve?" He nodded again in consent. "What happened to her mom?" To my surprise, he chuckled. "What's funny?" "You and Jen," he answered, the remains of an amused smile on his face. "You're both stubborn as hell." I just cocked my head at him, not sure what he meant by that. "She wanted me to ask you the same thing. You both asked me instead of talking to each other. Like normal people." I would have laughed at his teasing, but he brought up the memory. "About my family?" I clarified, unable to look him in the eyes and staring straight into the fire. "Yeah," Blake said, and then added, "Her mom was killed when she was 7, I think." "How?" I asked, holding my hands towards the flame to warm them. It was definitely getting colder these days. "She was mugged, in broad daylight too," he said sympathetically. "I guess she tried to scream for help. The guy shot her." I didn't know what to say, and I tried not to let it show that my stomach lurched. That's why Genevieve got so upset when I asked about it. It wasn't just that I got her dad and brother killed. She lost her entire family to thieves like me, and I was probably the living reminder of it. The reminder that she was stuck with. I didn't care that it was a setback to getting her to forgive me. It just made me feel even guiltier now than it did before. She'd already been justified in hating me, and this was yet another connection for her to make. "You don't have to tell me about your family if you don't want to," Blake said, because I hadn't yet responded to his answer. "It's okay," I said reassuringly. I hadn't talked about it once since the beginning of the infection. But if I was ever going to, now was the time. Maybe he'd tell Genevieve, and maybe she'd understand why I was scared enough to choose being with the Raiders over being alone. "You remember the week of the outbreak? How it all happened so fast?" Blake nodded in recollection. "My dad came home, sick one day, and shut himself in his room. It was right at the time that we started seeing it all over the news, the military mobilizing, and the anchormen telling people not to go to the hospitals because they were overcrowded." Blake nodded again, and I could tell he remembered it perfectly. My mom wouldn't let me see him because she wanted him to get enough rest. I was in my room the next night, and I tried to remember what I'd been doing. It was so long ago. I don't know, practicing on my piano or something. And I heard a scream. Blake was watching me intently now, and I saw him scoot a little bit closer on his log to mine, like he was getting ready to come over. By the time I got downstairs, he'd bitten my mom and my oldest sister. I continued. Right as I got there, he bit my other sister and turned on me. The only weapon I could find in the house was the hammer, sitting on the dining room table, because my mom had been putting nails in the wall to hang a painting. I begged him to stop, told him that he was scaring me. There'd been tears streaming down my face. My dad hadn't looked like the Farrells did now, so emaciated and mangly they hardly seemed human anymore. My dad had been so sick, he hadn't even changed out of his business suit. It made me want to hug him, like I did every day when he came home from work. But you know how it is. There's nothing left in there. I hit him with the hammer. I only wanted to hurt him, to make him stop, but he just kept coming. Kept coming and coming until I'd hit him so many times. I took a deep breath, barely able to say it even now. He bled to death. After that, I collapsed. Went so completely catatonic, the only evidence I was even alive was my constant sobbing. When I recovered, my mom and my sister, Millie, were just waking up, and the fever killed Becca. I could tell that they weren't right, you know. They had the same look in their eyes that my dad did. So empty. I looked Blake in the eyes for the first time, and seeing that he looked like he wanted to hug me, I glanced away. I wasn't as scared of them coming after me like my dad did. I was scared of killing them like him, slow. All I had was a hammer, but I made it fast. "Echo," Blake said softly, and then it seemed like he didn't know what to say. "That's horrible." I held back tears, trying not to take offense at his accusation. "I've done more horrible things than that." "What?" he asked in confusion, and a moment later he swiftly moved to my side. "Not of you, for you." When I looked up at him, when I saw the sincerity on his face, a single tear slid down my cheek. "You know it's not your fault, right?" It felt like my fault. "If there's a cure," I told him, knowing it was one of the soldiers' biggest missions. and it was for nothing." He just shook his head, still appearing unable to find something to say. At least my tears were done. I didn't want to seem too vulnerable. Anyway, it was a long time ago. Genevieve just knows which buttons to push. He didn't say anything, and when I glanced over, he was studying me. "What?" "I can't figure you out sometimes," he said, stretching his legs and leaning back on his hands. "Obviously you're a raider," he continued, twitching his mouth up in a half-smile, as if to say, "No offense. And it's obvious what that means, and I can see why you're dangerous." He gave that smile once more, before shrugging. "But then you start talking, and if I try to read you, I can see the regret." Blake glanced over at me again for a brief moment, and then he gave a soft sigh. "It's like you're two different people, and I can't figure out which one of you is real." "Most of the time, I'm not sure either," I admitted, rubbing my hands together and then sticking them out to the fire again. "But there are two things I'm sure of." I paused to look at him, and he was raising his eyebrows curiously. "The regret is real, and I'm gonna make it up to Genevieve, or I'm gonna die trying." His eyebrows dropped thoughtfully, and he took in a breath to speak, but then closed his mouth to think some more. Eventually, he took another gulp of inquisitive air. "No offense, but why do you care so much if..." "You get an hour of freedom?" Genevieve interrupted, scaring both Blake and I enough that we swiveled around to face her. "And you sit here the entire time with McMahon?" "I walked around a bit," I told her with a chuckle, grateful for the interruption, so I wouldn't have to answer the question Blake had been about to ask. "Did you eat?" she asked, and when I nodded, she motioned for me to come with her. "See you later, Blake," I heard him say bye, as I strode away with Genevieve. She was carrying a small burlap bag in her hands, and she held it up to explain what it was for. "We're gonna get some herbs. You wanted me to teach you, right?" "Yeah." I was kind of surprised she remembered, seeing as when I asked, she'd given me one of those dirty looks that always lets me know that I should shut up. "I'll carry the bag," I offered, even though there was nothing in it, and I doubted herbs would make it heavy. I wanted to start doing little things to make her see that I wasn't as bad as she thought. Maybe it would put me on a faster track to forgiveness. What was that hour alone about, anyway? Genevieve turned toward the river, looking over at me while she handed me the sack and answered. "It was Captain Greeley's idea." Blake was right. "He thinks I'm starting to trust you." That got me curious. And even though I didn't want to ruin the fact that she'd started off the day being nice to me, I had to ask. "Are you?" We reached the river and started downstream toward a spot where there were large rocks that we could use to cross without getting wet. "Nope," she answered. But I knew it was a lie. If it wasn't that she'd given me my knife back and let me keep my bobby pins, it was that she was less consistently hostile toward me. Lately, she only got furious if she was in a bad mood, or if I said or did something that triggered it. To be honest, it was still often, but not as often as when I first got here. And that was progress. When we reached the rocks, I hurried ahead of her and crossed first. The last stone in the bank wasn't far enough to leap, but it was far enough away that it was a stretch. With the rocks being wet and slippery, it was easy to fall. Even though I was the clumsy one, as Genevieve reached it, I held out my hand to offer her help. Forgiveness. And maybe a little bit of traction. "I'm okay," she declined, hopping off the rock to the muddy bank and looking at me like my offer was incredibly bizarre. She watched me awkwardly for a couple more seconds before continuing forward.
Lesson 1,
she said, a few minutes later, dropping onto her knees in front of a patch of purple flowers.
Chicory.
I squatted at her side, watching as she dug around one of the plants until she could easily pull it up, roots and all, out of the dirt. What's it for? She brushed off as much dirt as she could, and then dropped it into the sack I was holding open for her.
The leaves are edible,
she explained, starting to dig out the next one.
And sometimes the coffee we drink at breakfast isn't coffee.
When she pulled the next plant out of the dirt, she pointed to the root.
You brew these instead.
Really? I asked in shock, studying the plant when she handed it to me. I dropped the chicory into the sack, standing as Genevieve put one more in too. Then I held out my hand for her again, offering to help her up. This time, out of pure thoughtlessness, she took it. And only after she was on her feet did she give me that same unsure stare. Did that guy teach you this stuff? I said hurriedly, trying to think back to when she had mentioned something about this, since it looked like she was trying to find a reason to get mad at me about being so helpful. Cap's run?
Connolly,
she confirmed, and began leading me further into the woods.
He taught a few of us before he died. It's helped a lot.
She'd been turning her head side to side to scan our surroundings, and now she pushed herself onto her tiptoes to see over a large shrub.
Today's our lucky day,
she said with a smile, veering to the left. I followed her to a bush filled with red spots, and she immediately picked one and popped it into her mouth.
You're not allergic to raspberries, are you?
I shook my head and held out the bag so that she could drop some of the fruits into it. Just strawberries. While she picked some of those, I noticed another plant nearby, growing up on the side of the tree, and that had some kind of berries on it, greenish and small. What are these ones? I asked, reaching out to pick one and show it to her.
Don't touch that,
she hollered, scaring me so badly I jumped back like the plant would bite me.
Did you touch it?
I don't know, I said, panicking a little by the tone of her voice. What is it?
Poison ivy, you dumbass,
she told me. I was holding my stiff hand out in front of me, and through an amused laugh, she asked again,
Did you touch it?
Are you messing with me? I glared because she was laughing, but she shook her head, and I figured it must have been the look on my face that she found entertaining. I don't know. A leaf might have touched the back of my hand. I was so panicked now, I wasn't even sure. She was still laughing, but she looked around again. After searching for a few minutes, she walked a few feet away to pick another plant, and then came back.
Show me where.
I gave her my hand and pointed with my other. Oh God, I'm gonna get all rashy. Genevieve chuckled and grabbed a water bottle out of her backpack to rinse the spot off.
Shake it,
she instructed, and after I shook the water away, she pulled my hand closer, using the sleeve of her sweater to dab up the rest of the liquid. Once it was dry, she took the knife from her thigh. I immediately tugged away, thinking that she might cut me, and after snorting with laughter, she used it to split the stem of the plant she'd picked. Then she put the knife back and prompted me for my hand.
You'll probably be fine,
she assured me, delicately rubbing the inside of the stem over the place I'd showed her.
Just don't touch anything else without asking me first, okay?
Thanks, I nodded, though I couldn't help staring at her as she dropped my hand. I liked when she touched me without throwing a punch. She could be so gentle when she wanted, and it felt so natural. She noticed I was staring at her, and uncomfortably pointed to the plant to distract me.
Poison ivy. Remember what it looks like.
Then she held up a leaf she'd picked and motioned back toward where she'd gathered it.
Jewelweed. Rub it on right after it, and it prevents a rash.
Got it, I told her, and picked up the bag I'd dropped in my fright. What's next? She stared back in the direction we'd been heading before finding the raspberries.
I'll keep looking for stuff.
I didn't say anything for a while after that. It was probably all in my head, but my hand was itchy, and I was still kind of afraid of getting a rash. It kept me distracted enough that I forgot about Genevieve until she spoke to me again.
What were you and Blake talking about?
I raised a curious eyebrow at her, wondering why she'd asked.
When I got there, you both looked at me like I was interrupting something suspicious.
Just random stuff. She interrupted something suspicious, that's for sure. And lucky for me, too. The last thing I needed was Blake knowing just how much I cared. I can see why he's your best friend. He's a great guy. As I answered, my eyes wandered to Genevieve's backpack. I'd forgotten mine at the tent, so the only thing I was carrying was a small sack of plants. She had the bag and her rifle over her shoulders, and I noticed that the rifle bumped into her hip every step she took. To continue my forgiveness route, I added as a brief side note, "Is your backpack heavy? You want me to carry it?"
Okay, what are you doing?
She asked skeptically, swiftly turning on her heels to face me. What am I doing? I asked, even though I knew what she meant. I'd taken the routine too far, made it too obvious, and now it had weirded her out.
You keep trying to help me with things, and talking about Blake like he's an angel.
She was glaring at me. Perfect.
You're being freakishly nice. Stop it.
I can't be nice? I scoffed in amusement.
No,
she said seriously. And then that word I hate slipped off of her tongue.
You're a murderer. You're not nice.
I'm not a murderer, Genevieve, I yelled instinctively, forgetting all about my goal of making it up to her, as I felt the start of an offended anger.
Really?
She asked sarcastically.
Have you ever killed anyone when it wasn't self-defense?
I just scowled at her, because she'd made it so much more black and white than it really was.
It's a simple question,
she said impatiently, when I didn't supply an answer.
Yes or no?
My silence answered for me.
See? She pointed at me. Murderer. Ergo, you can't be nice.
She turned to walk away, but now I was mad. Don't pretend like you know anything about me. I growled, and in aggravation stomped after her.
You're right.
She turned on me again, getting more irritated now than I was.
I don't know anything about you. Where's the girl I used to know? She was nice.
Forget it, I mumbled, because her bringing up who I used to be was like a blow to the stomach. I'd give anything to still be that girl.
She never would have killed anyone,
Genevieve continued, taking an aggressive step forward when I took an intimidated step back.
Hey, she tapped me on the forehead. Are you there?
Okay. I brushed her hand away, trying to get her to stop because she was causing a crushingly guilty pain in my chest.
I wonder what she'd say if she could see you now,
she told me, and then she tapped me on the forehead again.
Come out. I want to talk to you.
Stop! I pushed her hand away more forcefully. I get it. But once she found a way to get to me, she rarely relented until it was too late.
Are you in there? Huh?
She tapped me harder.
I want to ask her myself how disappointed she is.
Tap, tap, tap.
Hello?
Genevieve, stop! I shouted, growing so provoked that I put my hands on her shoulders and shoved her back. She is disappointed, I yelled before she could recover and try to start a physical fight with me. I know what I've done, and it kills me. Satisfied?
No, I'm not satisfied,
she hollered angrily.
I want you to suffer for the things you've done.
Are you that fucking blind? I asked, throwing up my hands in frustrated exasperation. I suffer every day, but I had to choose between killing and dying.
I wish you chose dying,
she quipped bitterly, And even though I knew she felt that way about me, it still hurt. "Congratulations," I said forlornly, trying not to let it show just how much that stung. "Because you're starting to make me wish I had too." She just blinked at me, as if she never expected me to say that. I was surprised to see her eyes get watery, though I was sure it was mostly frustration. "I hate you, Echo," she told me quietly. But it didn't sound like she was telling me. It sounded like she was telling herself. Like she had to convince herself it was still true, because God forbid she feel a little damn sympathy. "I'm working on that," I responded honestly. "Don't," she blinked away the tears and looked me dead in the eye. "It won't work." She turned and began to walk away, and I opened my mouth to try to find something to say. Before I could get anything out, a familiar smell stopped me. It was slight and swift, blown by on the breeze. But it was so familiar that I knew what it was instantly. Genevieve. I didn't even get to finish saying her name before something slammed into her, and she disappeared into the nearby bush. I was there before her and the feral even hit the ground, and it almost had his teeth in her arm when I pulled out my pocket knife. I used my booted foot to kick the thing off of her, and the moment it landed on its back, I threw myself on top of it, leading with my blade. It roared for a few seconds when I plunged my weapon into its chest, and then it expired. Genevieve had scrambled up, and now she was holding her rifle, scanning the area around us for more ferals. "Any more of you?" she asked loudly, trying to attract them with noise if there were others. I got up and stood at her side, waiting to see if anything else would come at us. "This is not good," she mumbled after a minute, glancing back at the lifeless creature, and tapped me on the arm. "Come on." Keeping up with her was a struggle as she sprinted all the way back to camp, and then into Cap's meeting tent. He wasn't happy to hear about what happened, and even though security had already been doubled because of the ferals found before, he added more people to patrols, including Genevieve and I. I didn't like thinking of what it could mean. I'd only just found the salvation of a camp. The last thing I wanted was for us to have to leave, because ferals were starting to wander into the woods. Genevieve and I patrolled for what seemed like a couple of hours before she finally said anything to me. I felt like she'd been in deep thought the whole time, probably pondering the same fears I had. It was obvious she loved this place more than anything. "Thanks," she said, "for saving me." That hadn't been what I was expecting. "You don't have to thank me." She gave a small shrug and adjusted the rifle over her shoulder. "You could have let it eat me." "So Cap could kill me for killing you?" I chuckled at how ridiculous that was. "No thanks." "You could have made something up," she told me. "Told everyone you did everything you could. That way they'd still let you live here. Life would probably be easier for you that way." That's what she'd been thinking about this whole time. It sort of canceled out her gratitude. The fact that she thought I'd really do something like that. "Genevieve," I sighed in frustration, stopping and turning toward her so that she'd take me seriously. "Don't you understand that you rescued me by bringing me here?" She didn't look fazed by it. She didn't care. "I'd take a bullet for you." "Maybe one day you'll get a chance," she mumbled, continuing along the path of our patrols. "The feral didn't change anything?" I asked in disappointment as I hurried after her. Saving her had been instinct, but since then I was kind of hoping it would get her to forgive me some, or at least trust me more. "You killed my family." She looked back at me long enough to give me a fierce scowl. "Stabbing a feral doesn't make up for that." She was walking faster, just like she always did, when I made her mad. And in my attempt to keep up with her, I almost tripped on a large fallen branch. "Doesn't it make you like me even a little?" I asked optimistically, regaining my balance and jogging to catch up. She stopped to face me, glaring with an angry frown. "Gratitude, Echo. That's all you're going to get," she said irritably, grumbling as she walked away again. "Take it or leave it." I sighed once more, trudging in the direction she'd stormed off ahead of me. Take it. I guess it was something. Chapter 15. All right. Dugan. "Weapons?" I asked, glancing over my rifle to make sure the magazine was full.
"Check,"
Kara answered, doing the same with her shotgun. "Backpacks?" I adjusted the straps to the one I had over my own shoulders.
"Check."
"And food," I said, and both Kara and I looked into the duffel bag we'd scavenged specifically for food. That way we could carry as much of it as possible. There was more of it left in the basement than we could fit into the duffel bag, and we could have stayed in the basement until all of it was gone. It was the only guarantee of a sure meal of an extended period of time. But our end goal was to find that camp in the forest, if it actually existed. The food here in the basement was a sure thing, but it wasn't long-term. We'd have to leave eventually, and both of us were impatient to continue our journey. Besides, the time we'd spent here gorging ourselves had been more than enough to recover our strength. We were refreshed and ready.
"Check,"
Kara confirmed, looking up at me to see what was next. I tossed the duffel bag on over my backpack, setting the strap horizontally across my chest so I could tighten it as much as possible. It was a bit uncomfortable, but this position was more stable if we needed to run than having it dangling by my side. Plus, with all the cans in it, it was too heavy to carry on one shoulder the whole time. "Let's do it," I said, taking out my knife while Kara held her fire axe at the ready. With that, we eased open the basement doors, poised at the entrance for a minute to make sure no ferals were going to come running at us. Finding that the coast was clear, we started our retreat out of town, keeping to the shadows until we reached the highway, and then ducking behind car after car to avoid detection. In order to get across the country, we had two options: take Interstate 40 all the way across, or use smaller highways that were less direct. Seeing as the 40 was a popular interstate, I thought it would be best we take the less frequented roads. That way, there wouldn't be as many cars to be wary of. Eventually, we reached the first of a small highways we'd been traveling across the country on, and I was pleased to find our calculations were correct. There wasn't a car in sight for miles. We strode along at the middle of the road in silence for a while before I happened to glance up. I almost stopped walking just so that I could take in the brilliance of the star-specked sky above us.
"What are you doing?"
Kara asked, when my staring upward had caused my pace to slow. "Looking at the stars," I told her, and then resumed looking straight ahead to keep our pace. I was just thinking about how we couldn't really see any of them where I used to live, before the outbreak.
"Where was that?"
She stopped walking and tilted her head straight up to take it in. "Los Angeles," I answered. She nodded like she knew what I was talking about, and said innocently,
"In Hollywood."
"Yeah," I agreed with a chuckle. "Close to Hollywood." She nodded again, resuming her pace down the highway so that I could follow along. After a few minutes of silence, she began to hum to herself, and it wasn't long after that I recognized the beat. "What are you singing?" I asked curiously. She shrugged, perhaps because she didn't know what it was called. But then she sang shyly,
"We all want to change the world, but when you talk about destruction..."
I knew the song well, so I finished the next line for her. Don't you know that you can count me out? She looked over at me with a smile, and even though her voice remained quiet, she continued in a playful high-pitched squeal. Don't you know it's gonna be? All right, I continued the lyrics, though that was all that I could get through because I was laughing so hard at how her voice had sounded. How do you know that song? It's way before your time.
My dad used to sing it all the time,
she said through a giggle. You know who it's by? I asked, to which she shook her head. Did your dad ever tell you about the Beatles? Again she shook her head, and I sighed with exasperated disappointment. They were legends, I told her excitedly. One of their biggest singles had over 7 million sales, and they spent more time than you could imagine on the top charts. I glanced over at her to see if she could even comprehend what I was telling her, and I couldn't help but laugh. And you're looking at me like a teenager who has no clue what I'm talking about.
Sorry. I like the song, though, she chuckled. Did you ever watch them play?
Well, I started, and then gave an embarrassed but amused huff of breath. I was sort of too young, too. She laughed at that. Have you ever heard the real thing?
I don't know, she said thoughtfully. I think so, because I can imagine the tune in my head, but I can't remember ever hearing it other than when Dad would sing it.
Kara had been so young when all of this happened that she'd practically grown up in a feral-infested world. It made me curious what she could recall. Do you remember anything from before the outbreak?
I have a couple of memories, she answered. Like when I was stung by a scorpion in the backyard, or when Dad got me a little robot dog for my birthday, but nothing really.
And she hesitated to find the right word.
Important.
What about your mother? I asked, since I hadn't so much as heard her mention it since I'd found her.
She was in jail?
She said slowly, like she wasn't sure.
I think. My dad didn't really talk about her much.
Oh, I mumbled uncomfortably, not exactly sure what to say to her about that. Her gaze wandered toward me at my discomfort, but though she seemed to notice, she didn't seem affected by it, almost as if she didn't recognize it as something to be ashamed of. I guess it wasn't, anyway, seeing as prison didn't exist anymore. Well, I think anything that we can remember is important, I assured her. She nodded in agreement, setting the fire axe over her shoulders and hanging her arms over it lazily.
Do you have a favorite memory?
I had a lot of time to make a lot of memories, I told her with a sad, reminiscent sigh. But the one that comes to mind is the day my daughter Christina was born.
That was a happy day?
Kara asked, knowingly. Happy, I repeated with a laugh. I'd never been more terrified in my life. Maybe you'll know one day, I said, and then added protectively, when you're much, much older. Kara snickered amusedly. It's scary to love something as much as you love your kids. She'd be your age, if... At that we were silent for a few minutes, and then Kara asked quietly,
Does it get easier?
I glanced over at her, somewhat surprised by the melancholy tone of her voice. Kara acted so strong all the time, I often forgot that she'd only recently lost her family. Yeah, I answered softly, and then paused thoughtfully to really consider whether that was true. Yeah, it gets easier. Right after I answered, she grabbed my arm and stopped walking. I was worried she was finally going to have an emotional breakdown, until she pointed further down the road. Look. I squinted through the dark. It appeared that there was a light less than a mile away, dim and orange enough that it might be a fire. In order to see better, I raised my rifle and pressed my eye to the scope. Sure enough, it was a fire, dimmed by the fact that we were seeing it through the windows of some vehicles that had been set horizontally across the highway to block it off. Because there were cars in the way, I couldn't see how many people there were, or what kind of people. "We'll head off the road a little bit," I told Kara, nodding toward the stretch of desert on our right. "We can get close enough to see if maybe there are other survivors, but we'll stay out of sight in case they're bandits." If they were survivors, that seemed nice enough to approach. Maybe they'd want to head east with us. Kara gave her approval, and we started off the road until we crossed over a small hill so we weren't visible from the highway. In tense anticipation, I kept my rifle in both hands instead of slinging it back over my shoulder, and Kara did the same with her axe. I walked along the side of the hill, just enough to see when we were coming up to the camp, my feet sinking into the cold sand beneath me. Part of me was even more worried about rattlesnakes than I was about the people, so I kept my ears alert for any warning of the reptiles. Soon enough, we were in line with the camp, and we both plopped onto our stomachs at the edge of the hill so that we could look in. We discovered that the cars weren't just a line on the road, but that the people had created a complete circle of vehicles around their small camp. There were 5 of them, 4 men and a woman, and 2 large, mixed-breed dogs. I couldn't tell if there were more, maybe lying down, because the vehicles hindered my view. They were all sitting in fold-up lawn chairs around the fire. I used my rifle again to get a better look, searching for any weapons they might have had. One of the men was holding a machete in his lap. Against 2 other chairs were leaned a police baton and a steel baseball bat. The others might have weapons, but I couldn't see them. "What do you think?" Kara asked in a cautious whisper. "It's too risky," I answered quietly, looking over at her in the dark. Just because they had a woman with them didn't mean that they weren't bandits. It seemed only logical thieves would want to set up on a highway. "I think we should just keep going." When I turned my gaze back toward the camp, one of the massive dogs were standing on the hood of a car, its pointed ears directed straight at us. The people at the camp had grown silent, and the air was still enough that I could hear the dog growling. "What do you got there, Rocky?" one of the men asked the dog, and in response it snarled our way. Shit. The canine knew we were here. Before either one of us could react, another man clicked on a powerful flashlight, and I knew for a fact that the beam caught us before we ducked behind the cover of the hill. "You there!" called a male voice. "Come on out." Kara looked at me questioningly, and I shook my head. "I'm gonna count to 3. He waited a moment to see if we'd comply. 1. I was hoping they'd think that they were seeing things and forget about us. 2. I heard what sounded like the scraping of nails against metal, and by the time the man said 3, I could hear the snarling of the dogs coming up the other side of the hill. Kara and I hardly had a chance to scramble back before the canine came leaping over the peak. It landed right on me, and I managed to grab the fur on both sides of its neck before it took a bite out of me. In using its fur to push it away, all the dog's skin was being pulled away from its face, and all I could see were its slimy gums and dripping white fangs snapping together only inches away. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Kara wind up with her axe, and when she sent it flying into the dog's side, the animal let out a deafening yell. "Son of a bitch!" yelled one of the men in response to the canine's cry, and the next set of nails against metal was accompanied by some thuds, and I knew the whole group was jumping over their barriers to begin pursuit. "Kara, run!" I instructed, scrambling off the ground. We both took off further into the desert, angry shouts not far behind. Even closer was the snarling huffs of the next dog, hot on our trails. The soft sand beneath our feet was a disadvantage for everyone, but even more debilitating was a large and heavy bag of food on my back. It caused each of my feet to sink further into the sand, and it made running near impossible. Kara was ahead of me, so when the next dog reached us, it launched itself onto my back. "Keep going," I shouted as I lost my footing, because Kara had stopped and was about to backtrack. I fell forward, feeling the duffel bag of food shift over my shoulder as the beast tore into it. Better the bag than my flesh. And at the same time that I shuffled out from under the bag, I pulled out my knife. On my feet, I sent the toes of my shoes at the ribs of the distracted dog. And even though I hated to do it, I plunged my knife into its chest so it wouldn't keep chasing us. Once I killed the dog, I didn't have time to grab the food, because the first man was only 20 feet away. I left it where it was, and started sprinting in the direction Kara had continued, leaving the bandits behind. "Keep running, you bastards!" the man hollered, firing a gunshot in our direction. At least it didn't sound like he was going to keep following. "I'll skin you alive for what you did to my dogs." Keep running is exactly what we did, until I could barely breathe from pushing so hard. I put my hands on my knees and bent over, trying to catch my breath, while Kara threw the axe over her shoulders again and leaned back, heaving just as hard as I was. It was only a few moments before her eyes widened at me, and she pushed on my shoulder to turn me around. "Where's the food?" she asked in panic. "I had to let it go," I panted. She strode a few steps in the direction we'd just come from, staring through the dark as if she could still see the road. "We have to go back." "I know," I said, waving her off tiredly. "Give me a second." It wasn't just that I needed a moment to recover. I needed a moment to let it sink in what we needed to do in order to get our food back. There had to be a way other than killing them. "Before they eat it all," Kara complained, still panicking. I couldn't help but laugh, and I set a hand on her shoulder to calm her down. "There's a lot of food in there. Relax. We'll get it back." She searched my face and nodded compliantly. I sat down in the sand and threw my arms over my folded-up knees to ponder. We need to think of a plan. Kara dropped down next to me, and we sat there for a while in pensive silence.
"I think I got it,"
she said eventually, and I nodded for the younger mastermind to continue.
"One of us could be the distraction and lure them away from the camp again. The other one could sneak in and take the bag."
I tilted my head while I considered her proposal, and she added,
"I'll be the distraction."
"It's too risky," I told her. She was small, and her short legs wouldn't carry her far enough with every stride to outrun grown men.
"Okay, then I'll sneak in and grab the bag," she shrugged.
"It's too heavy," I sighed. "If they see you, then you'll never be able to run away with it fast enough." Kara sighed too, but she sounded aggravated.
"You worry about me too much."
I looked over at her curiously, surprised she was asserting herself.
"If you're always worried about protecting me instead of letting me help you, then we'll both end up dead."
I didn't say anything right away, so she added to aid her argument.
"The plan to get the food in the first place ended up fine, because we did it together."
I took in a thoughtful breath, weighing the consequences of her plan, and of abandoning my wish to protect her, for working as a team.
"Dugan,"
Kara said impatiently. All right, I chuckled. She really was concerned about that food. "You can be the distraction, but once they start coming after you, you run like hell, okay?" She nodded vigorously. "You remember the last road sign we passed, with the highway numbers on it?" Again she nodded. "That'll be our rendezvous. As soon as you lose them, head straight there." We immediately started back toward the camp, and when we reached the hill, I pulled my watch off my wrist and handed it to Kara. "I'm gonna head to the other side. give me 3 minutes.
Okay,
she whispered in response, and I saw her counting down.
Go.
On go, I started sprinting down the road until I was far enough that they wouldn't be able to see me cross, and then I ran to the other side of the highway and to the opposite hill from the one Kara was crouched behind. The remaining seconds until she created a distraction were excruciating, and it felt like forever. Eventually, I saw her appear at the top of the hill.
Hey, assholes,
she hollered, throwing a handful of pebbles at them.
You took my food. What else do you want?
All 5 of them stood, and when one of them shouted, "Get her!" they took off after an already retreating Kara. I'd been hoping they'd be dumb enough to forget that there were 2 of us. But before leaving, one of them told the female to stay and watch the camp. At least only one of them was staying behind, and I grabbed a baseball-sized rock on my way down the hill. I crept to the side of the vehicles without being spotted because the woman was staring after the men that had disappeared. Then I straightened up and pulled my arm back, mentally apologizing before I let the rock fly. It was right on target, and after I struck the woman on the back of the head, she dropped with a thud. I put a hand on the hood of the car, about to vault myself over it, when a gunshot sounded from somewhere over the hill. My head whipped in the direction it came from, and I felt all the blood drain from my face. I'd chosen the wrong part in this plan. It should have been me that was the distraction. That way all Kara would have had to contend with was the woman. Despite the panic-stricken void in my thought process, my feet kept moving. I jumped over the vehicle, grabbed the duffel bag of food, and immediately started running back toward the rendezvous point. When I got there, Kara was nowhere to be found, and my panic multiplied. I dropped the duffel bag on the side of the road and began pacing worriedly, working as a team. She's still a child, for Christ's sake. I never should have let her do that part. How could she outrun a grown man? And if they caught her, then what? At the thought of what could happen to her if they'd kept her alive, I nearly got lightheaded, and I sat down at the edge of the highway. I stood again a minute later. I couldn't just sit there. They'd captured her. They'd probably take her back to their fire and keep her there. I had to go back and rescue her. And if they had her, then I couldn't be picky about killing them. In order to make sure that the food was safe while I went to look for Kara, I began to move it further off the road where I could hide it.
You got it!
Exclaimed an excited voice from behind me. I swiveled around, almost collapsing with relief, because the sigh I let out was so deep. Are you okay? What happened? I asked hurriedly. I heard the gunshot.
I'm fine,
she answered.
I hid, but one of them found me.
She glanced away like she was afraid I'd be mad at her.
I had to shoot him.
Oh my God, I said through another sigh of relief. I was so glad that she was okay that I wanted to pull her into a hug. Instead, I rubbed my hands over my face, and after I'd thrown the duffel bag over my shoulder, I gave her a pat on the back. I thought it was you. She shook her head.
I was wondering why you looked so scared when I walked up.
Kid, I laughed, starting to lead her back into the desert so that we could go the long way around this time. Don't ever scare me like that again.
I'll try,
she assured me.
Especially since you're old enough, I got to worry about a heart attack.
She'd started giggling before she even finished her teasing, and she laughed even harder when I tried to give her a shove and she easily danced away. Still grinning, she resumed her place at my side, singing happily in a high-pitched voice.
Don't you know it's gonna be?
All right, I finished with a chuckle. Everything sure was.
Chapter 16. Chilled to the morrow. Genevieve. Hey, Dad. I greeted my father with a smile and a huge hello, and then tossed my backpack onto the kitchen table. I noticed he was working over some new kitchen appliance, but before I could question him about it, he asked,
How was practice?
It was fine, I answered. and as I hopped onto the kitchen counter, my little brother came running in. "Genevieve!" he shouted excitedly. "You want to play PlayStation with me?" I nodded happily and hopped down, but my dad stopped me before I strode off.
"At least take your muddy cleats off first, please,"
he said, pointing back in the direction of the front door. I turned the way he pointed, and he whispered after me,
"And come back here real quick when you're done."
I did what he'd told me, and once I returned to the kitchen, I leaned back against the counter at his side. "What is this thing?" I asked, finally setting a hand on the small appliance he was working over.
"It's a juicer,"
he answered, motioning to all the vegetables he had laid out on the counter on the other side of him. "What?" I chuckled.
"A juicer,"
he repeated, laughing at the skeptical crease on my forehead.
"You drink the vegetable juice it puts out and get more nutrients faster. It's healthy."
"I'm healthy," I assured him, making sure to pout my lips in disgust when he handed me the cup of green liquid.
"It's not for you,"
he whispered, making a deliberate glance toward the living room where Micah was. His whole life, my little brother had been a little sickly. There wasn't really anything wrong with him, according to the doctors. He was just frail. Too bad my dad hadn't told me that before I took a sip. At the bitter taste that washed over my tongue, I nearly choked, and I set the cup down on the counter so that I could pat my chest soothingly. I am so glad that's not for me.
"Well,"
my dad mumbled hesitantly.
"in a way, it kind of is."
I raised my eyebrow at him for explanation.
"I already tried, but he won't drink it."
And he picked up the cup, trying to hand it to me again.
"Not unless you can convince him."
I took a sniff of the drink and nearly gagged. This might just kill the kid, I laughed. But he didn't find it as amusing as I did.
"Jen, I'm at my wit's end,"
he sighed, pleadingly, stressfully massaging his fingertips over his eyes.
"If he misses any more school because he's sick."
I let it sink in for a few moments, what I thought he was implying. It'd been 8 years since my mom died. My father had recovered as much as I ever thought he would. But sometimes I could tell that being a single dad was harder on him than he let show. So I tried to keep on a cheerful smile. "Fine. But you at least have to put some apple juice in here or something."
"It's processed,"
he complained when I opened the refrigerator to grab the jug of juice.
"That defeats the point."
I put the green juice into a bigger cup and then filled the rest of it with the sweet apple juice. "It defeats the point if he won't drink it at all," I pointed out, tasting the new concoction. It still wasn't great, but at least it didn't make me want to hurl. I waited before leaving to see if my dad would agree. He nodded, but his gaze had fallen to the spot on the floor across the kitchen, and he was lost in some sad thought. "I love you," I told him, wrapping one arm around his waist to give him a hug. "You're the best dad in the world." He stared for another second before forcing a smile and returning the embrace.
"Thanks. I love you too."
I held up the drink as I started walking backward toward the living room. "If I have to bribe him, you owe me $20. I was glad to see a genuine laugh light up his face. "What are we playing?" I asked my brother as I plopped down onto the couch beside him, purposely setting the drink down on the coffee table where he could see it. "Madden," he answered, handing me the second controller. Then his eyes wandered to the cup. "What's that?" he asked skeptically. "Veggie juice," I told him, picking it up and taking a small gulp. He visibly shuddered when I did, and remembering what my first taste had been like, I couldn't blame him. "Here, try it." He hesitated at first, watching my face for any sign of disgust, and then he slowly reached for the glass. He took a tasteful sip and smacked his lips in repulsion as he handed it back to me. No, thank you. I chuckled at his reaction and playfully waved the drink in front of his nose. Come on, drink it. It'll make you faster than me. No one's faster than you, he said, cocking his head at me like he was scolding me for the bluff. You could be, I suggested, trying to hold back a laugh at his attitude. Liar, he smirked knowingly. I sighed in defeat, and seeing no other way, I set the cup down. Okay, real talk? I offered, lowering my voice and leaning in, like I was going to tell him a secret. He nodded with interest. Dad's worried about you, I admitted, and I could tell that he instantly got as serious as I was. If you miss any more school, then you could get in a lot of trouble. Like, Micah started hesitantly, his eyes full of concern. With the principal? With people more important than the principal, I told him honestly. Do you remember when you broke that vase Dad gave Mom for their anniversary? And you were really sad, so I told him that I kicked a soccer ball into it, and I covered for you so that he wouldn't get mad at you? Micah nodded with recollection. I instantly felt bad for the sorrowful look in his eyes, but he was getting too old to be tricked into things. I had to start telling him the truth. This is kind of like that, okay? We have to cover for him so nobody gets mad at him. And all you have to do is drink this juice. That's it? He asked, glancing up at the cup on the table. That's it, I confirmed. He started to reach for it, but still hesitant, he took a deep breath and pulled back. Are you sure this will work? It's worth a shot, I told him with a shrug, and he gave an unwilling sigh. Tell you what, I said, and I grabbed the glass of liquid. I'll drink half of this one, and next time, whenever you have a cup, I'll have one too. Deal? He studied me for a minute like he was trying to discern whether or not I was lying, so I added, Me and you are always taking care of each other, but sometimes we have to take care of Dad too. At that, he glanced toward the kitchen where our father was, and then he nodded dutifully. Deal. I chugged half of the beverage, and then watched in triumph when my little brother swallowed the rest of it. A metallic click woke me in the stillness of the morning, and I lay quietly for a second before moving to see if I could pinpoint what it was. A moment later, there were a few more noises, and I knew Echo was cuffing herself back to her cot. Being as clumsy as she is, she must have dropped them on the floor, and that's what I'd heard at first. I'd woken up really early the other morning and seen that she'd taken the handcuffs off at night. I went back to sleep and woke up a little later to find that she'd put them back on. I wasn't sure how long she'd been doing it for, but that was 3 nights ago, and I'd been waking up early every day since then to discover the same thing. Don't bother, I told her, and turned in my bed to face her. Her eyes were wide with fright, like she was expecting me to get furious about it. But I couldn't. Maybe even a week ago, I would have been furious. But the truth was that lately, I didn't have the energy to get mad about little things. Most of the time, it was easier to just not give a shit. She'd frozen when I turned to face her, and her hand hovered over the cuffs, still prepared to lock herself in. Are you sure? Today was already one of those days where it hurt just to look at her. So as I turned onto my stomach to bury my face in my pillow, I mumbled, Whatever. I could hear Echo drop the cuffs after a whole other minute, like she'd finally decided I wasn't joking. What do you want me to do with them? She asked, sounding hesitant, sensitive as always to my mood. I answered without picking my head up. Just put them back in my backpack. Huh? She asked, since the pillow had muffled my words beyond recognition. I lifted my head just long enough to say brusquely, "Just put them in my backpack," and then I dropped my face again. She got off of her cot and shuffled around a bit, but after she zipped my backpack up and set it back on the floor, things went silent, like she was just standing there.
"Are you feeling okay?"
I didn't answer. For one, I didn't like that she sounded genuinely concerned, nor did I want to explain that she was the cause for my mood.
"Genevieve."
She pressed, but still I gave no response. She waited another minute before asking again,
"Are you sick?"
After her question, she touched my shoulder, either trying to be comforting or trying to get my attention. "No," I answered in aggravation, and when I angrily pushed myself up, she pulled her hand away, startled by my sudden movement. "I'm not sick," I told her, shoving my feet into my boots and not bothering to tie them before I threw on my sweater. Once that was on, I slung my rifle over my shoulder, picked up my eating utensils, and hurried out of the tent. Even though it was later in the morning, it was still pretty cold. Cold enough if I could bear seeing Echo's face right now, I would have gone back into the tent to grab my winter coat. Instead, I pulled the hood of my gray sweatshirt over my head, thankful for the slight warmth it offered. I was actually surprised that Echo hadn't caught up with me yet, seeing as whenever I stormed off, she usually followed. Nor had she reached me yet, as I got to the breakfast area. But I didn't think that she'd take too much longer, since I hadn't told her that she could stay alone, and I knew that she still got pretty nervous whenever I gave her a little freedom. I wasn't surprised to see Kellen eating with some of the other soldiers. We'd all had night patrols last night, so I was sure he'd slept in too. In hopes that Echo would find somewhere else to sit so that I wouldn't have to interact with her when she arrived, I plopped down uncomfortably close to Kellen's side, knowing that she generally liked to avoid him. Kellen's face lit up when I sat next to him.
"Morning, LT."
I just gave him a nod in acknowledgement, not really in the mood to talk to him yet either. And when the other soldiers around greeted me, I repeated the motion. Soon after that, Echo finally arrived, and while she didn't sit down at the same table as I did, she was within eyesight, and I did my best not to look at her. I don't know why some days hurt more than others. There were the occasional good days, when I could put up with her, though most of the time I was angry or annoyed. Every once in a while, I'd get one of these days. Before Echo showed up, there'd be times my dad and brother would cross my mind, and I'd miss them. Now that she was here, I think those times resulted in this, where no matter what she or I did, her presence caused me pain. I glanced over one time after I'd finished eating, only to find that Echo had finished too, and was just sitting there, waiting to see what I'd do. I'd only been half listening to the conversation going on around me the whole time anyway. So I stood, and with my utensils in hand, I started toward the river to rinse them. As I walked, there was the softest crunch of footsteps following behind me. It still impressed me that for being so damn clumsy, Echo was incredibly light on her feet. She didn't say anything while she trailed me to the river, or when she knelt at my side to wash her own dishes, or the entire way to the meeting tent so that I could talk to Cap. When we got to the tent, she silently made her way to her usual corner, while I gave Cap a nod in greeting.
"Morning,"
he said, smiling a little too cheerfully for the mood I was in.
"How'd patrols go last night?"
"Fine," I answered with a nonchalant shrug. "No ferals." It had been over 2 weeks since we'd doubled our patrols, and I hadn't heard of a feral being around since the one Echo saved me from. At that reminder, I stole a stealthy glance back at her. She'd already been leaning her head against the wall out of boredom. And when she noticed I was looking at her, she lifted it up and gave me the smallest of apprehensive smiles. Normally, I'd glare or turn back to Cap with attitude so that she'd get the point. But right now, with that sad feeling in my gut, all I could do was slowly move my gaze away and return my attention to Cap.
That's good news,
Cap said happily, and then switched to a different topic.
Second platoon is on supply run.
I nodded knowingly. They'd left a few days ago, and with how much they were supposed to be loading up, they probably wouldn't be back for a few more.
I'm sending you guys out as soon as they return. It's gonna start snowing soon.
I already knew why he was sending us out, but he said it again anyway.
I want to make sure that we have enough supplies to last us the winter.
Sounds good, I agreed. Usually our vehicles did an okay job getting through the snow, but weather was unpredictable, and it never hurt to be prepared for the worst. You know where you want us to go? He reached for the map he always kept at his table and spread it out as he answered.
I wanted to discuss it with you. You know better than I do the spots we've picked clean.
I stood up to get a better view of the map. The reality of the situation was that we'd pretty much picked clean every city that surrounded our forest. We're gonna have to travel, I told Cap, putting my palms flat on the table and leaning over the paper. If we want to check out big cities, we could head to Hartford. I pointed to Connecticut. Big cities were the only places I knew for sure had supplies left over. Sure, it was more dangerous, but all the ferals in the area usually made it less appealing to mass scavengers like us.
That's a long journey,
Cap mused, and as he examined the map, Echo stood and shuffled over to my side.
If you're up for it, I don't see a problem.
We don't have to go that far, Echo said before I could respond. I didn't much care what she had to say, but Cap appeared interested, so she continued.
I was all over Rochester, and it was always the suburbs that were easiest to pick from.
She pointed to the spot on the map, opposite of the direction I'd been heading with my assessment.
Have you guys hit Webster?
No, I answered.
Can we go there?
She asked. But I'd meant no, as in I wasn't taking her there. It was too close to Rochester, and I didn't trust her enough yet to put her too near her old raider buddies. We're not going to Webster.
Okay,
she mumbled unsurely, studying the map again.
What about Fairpoint?
I'm not taking you near Rochester, I growled impatiently. I was aware of Cap's watching the exchange, but he didn't say anything, and I knew he didn't want to interfere since Echo was my responsibility. He trusted me enough to make the call. Echo watched me for a few seconds thoughtfully.
Oh,
she said, as if finally understanding my motive.
I don't know about any suburbs on this side of the map.
After the outbreak and leaving Rochester with Cap, we'd practically gone rural. The only times I'd gone into the city was to get supplies. Even though I hated Echo giving input, she had survived in the city for the last 6 years. If anyone knew the best places to find supplies, I believed it was her. So I glanced up at Cap. Do you know of any suburbs in the area? I asked, using my finger to make a circle around the area south of the forest. Cap pursed his lips, scratching at his beard thoughtfully, while he examined the area I'd pointed to.
Maybe here,
he said eventually, setting his finger down.
At Clifton Park.
While I nodded, I committed the spot to memory. That way I could look at my own map later and figure out the best way to approach it. Okay. Anything else you need?
Not really.
Cap shook his head.
But you can find out from April which medical supply she needs the most.
After saying goodbye to Cap, I strode toward the medical cabin, hearing Echo follow along behind me. Since I hadn't so much as looked at her after listening to her input, it seemed she knew to leave me alone. April was in the cabin with Casey when I got there, and I waved at both of them in greeting. "Hey," I said from the door, just sticking my head in because I wouldn't need to stay long. "Can you guys start putting together a list of supplies you need? We're going on a run as soon as 2nd Platoon gets back."
Sure thing.
April consented happily, and after a thankful smile, I ducked out. Lately, after we had night patrols, we'd been taking the day off. The last thing I wanted to do right now was relax in a tent or outside the fire where Echo might feel obliged to talk to me. I couldn't handle it today. And for some reason, the fact that I was in this mood was frustrating, which only made it worse. Instead of resting, I grabbed a burlap sack from the food storage, and with Echo still following behind me, I headed into the woods to forage.
"We aren't taking the day off?"
she asked knowingly, finally sounding like she wanted to make conversation. I didn't answer her, and knelt down to gather the first of the useful plants I'd spotted. She was quiet for a minute, picking some of the plants on her own, but when I held the bag out to her so that she could put her spoils in it, without so much as looking at her, she spoke again.
"Are you mad at me?"
Without saying anything, I continued on, stopping at the next small herb I spotted.
"Is it about the handcuffs?"
she asked timidly.
"Are you mad that I took them off?"
With something of an annoyed groan, I immediately turned back toward camp. It didn't seem like she was going to let this go, and the only thing that I wanted now was to get back to camp so that I could dump her on Blake and have some time to myself. We weren't even really out of the camp's boundaries yet, and we'd hardly even gathered a handful of plants, but I didn't care. That sense of betrayal I felt just hurt too much today.
"Genevieve."
Echo pressed. I sighed and sped up. We were so close to my tent now that I could see Blake sitting at the fire, and Casey was already sitting there with him.
"Did I do something wrong?"
Echo asked as she jogged to catch up, stopping me only 20 feet from my relief. "Yes, for Christ's sake," I groaned in exasperation, finally turning toward her. "When are you gonna get it through your thick skull? You killed my family. Just leave me alone."
"Genevieve, I'm sorry,"
she whined, holding her hands out in sudden vexation. Up until now, I'd been in too low of a mood to get angry. But like it always did, that word set me off. "Stop apologizing!" I shouted. And I could tell after how quiet I'd been so far that it startled her, because she flinched. Even Blake and Casey turned around to look at us in surprise.
"What will it take then?"
she asked, clearly growing frustrated.
"What do I have to do for you to forgive me?"
"Can you bring them back?" I asked weakly. All the energy I had for anger had been expended in that one shout. Apathy was so much easier than being in pain. Instead of giving the obvious answer, Echo exhaled in defeat. "And there's nothing you can do. I'll never forgive you. I'll never like you. And I'll never want to be around you. So just give it up." Echo's eyebrows furrowed with offense.
"Damn it, Genevieve. Do you even remember what they look like?"
My eyes widened in shock at the question, and at my reaction she continued.
"What color eyes did your dad have, huh?"
she asked angrily. My heart dropped. I knew the answer to this. I had a picture of them in the trunk of my tent.
Were they brown, like yours, or were they hazel?
I glared at her. It had been so long since I'd looked at that picture, and she was confusing me.
Hell, maybe they were bright fucking blue.
Stop, I begged. This hurt more than looking at her, because I should be able to answer these questions without a doubt in my mind. But it had been so long.
What about your brother?
She continued, too offended or mad to care about the pleading look in my eyes.
Was his hair black or brown?
Both of those sounded right, and the crippling pain in my chest multiplied. Stop it, I begged again, louder this time, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see Blake turn around to face us, completely preparing to stop a fight if it got too out of hand.
Was it curly? She asked, or just a little wavy?
I could hardly stand it anymore. I was so confused, so ashamed.
Maybe it was perfectly straight.
Stop! I shouted pleadingly, unable to take any more. I was too upset to control myself, and the only way that I could see to stop her from talking was to hurt her, so I charged, catching her in the torso with my shoulder and taking her hard to the ground. It was obvious it knocked the wind out of her by the wheezing sound it made when she tried to suck in air, but I was so mad that I didn't care. I pushed up so that I was sitting over her, and since she was too focused on trying to breathe to block anything, I hit her in the jaw. That snapped her out of it, and when I went to punch her again, she dodged it. Immediately afterwards, she put her two hands together, and bringing her arms down fast, she slammed her fist so hard against my chest, I went tumbling backwards off of her. Blake came over at the same time both Echo and I darted up, grabbing my arm so that I wouldn't go after her again. But I wrenched away from him, charging Echo and taking her to the ground once more. I was in the same exact position, but before I could throw another hit, she grabbed my wrist.
"Genevieve, stop!"
she pleaded, struggling to hold on as I tried to tug my hands out of her grip.
"I don't want to hurt you."
"That's all you ever do!" I growled through the agony, yanking my right arm hard and finally managing to pull it free. Not a moment after I got out, she released her other hand's hold on my wrist, pushing her upper body off of the ground enough that she could wrap her arms around my neck before I threw another punch. Her shoulders met the dirt again, and she brought me down with her. And she had such a tight hold on me that I couldn't get enough leverage to punch her. I still tried. The only part of her that I could reach while she held me like that was her ribs, but I still threw my fist into them as hard as I could. I knew it hurt because her clutch on my neck tightened each time with pain, but it wasn't enough to get her to release me.
"Please,"
Echo begged. When my hitting didn't work, I squirmed, trying to wriggle out of her arms.
"I'm so sorry."
I was so hurt and mad and frustrated that I could feel tears stinging my eyes. I pushed against the ground so forcibly it lifted us both a couple of inches, but she still wouldn't release me. "Let me go," I hollered pleadingly, pushing up again and then purposely falling on her as we both hit the dirt, hoping it would get her to loosen her grip.
"I'm sorry I got them killed,"
she huffed, when as I dropped us to the ground again, it knocked some air out of her. My frustration had peaked, but her final apology brought back double the severe pain I'd been feeling all day. Brought back the agony she'd made me feel only a minute before. "Let me go," I begged again, pushing more frantically as I felt the first few tears run from my eyes. "I hate you. Let me go." I only struggled for a couple more seconds before my next words came out a sob. "Echo, please." I couldn't fight anymore. I was too exhausted. I collapsed onto Echo, completely giving up the idea of getting free on my own, and unable to try anymore due to the fatigue and the tears. I couldn't even get a word out. I just lay there, frustrated sobs causing my chest to heave against hers. She'd gotten so still once I collapsed, and now her grip loosened on my neck, and even though my face was buried against her shoulder, I could feel her turn her head to look at me. Maybe she was in shock that I was actually crying. Maybe she wasn't sure if it was a ploy to throw her off guard. But since she'd loosened her hold, and I was no longer struggling, this felt too much like a hug. I couldn't deny that it was a relief to let the tears flow. I'd been holding them back since she'd got here, and I felt some of my frustration subsiding. But not Echo. It couldn't be. I couldn't let it be her who comforted me. Not when she was the one causing all of this misery. Let me go, I begged, again through a final sob. And even though she didn't loosen her grip any more than she already had, reluctant to release me, she didn't try to stop me from pushing. I hate you, I sniffled. She lifted herself onto her elbows after I was hardly on my knees and still practically straddling her, looking like she wanted to say something, so I shoved her back down. Just leave me alone. I used the sleeve of my sweater to wipe the tears from my eyes as I raced past Blake and into my tent. However, once I buried my face in my pillow, more forced their way out. It was only for a minute, though, and then I frantically stood back up and threw open the lid of the trunk, digging things out until I found the picture I'd taken from the house in Rochester. I hugged it tight to my chest for a little while, and then I held it out so that I could look at it, so I could remember that they both had black hair just as straight as mine, that my dad's eyes had always been the same brown as mine, but Micah's were a muddy green. I hadn't forgotten, and I felt so relieved now that I was sure.
Genevieve?
Blake's voice practically whispered from the entrance of the tent, and a moment later he strode in. He'd sat down on the cot by my side before I even tore my eyes away from the picture to look at him.
Are you okay?
All I could do was glance back down at the picture and shrug. I wasn't sure how to answer that question. Okay was such a vague term. Physically, mentally, emotionally, the answer to all of those was, I don't know.
Why do you fight with her like that?
He asked a minute later, when he realized I wasn't going to answer. His voice was so soft, like he was trying desperately hard not to upset me.
You're making this so hard on yourself.
What do you want me to do? I asked desperately. How am I supposed to act toward the girl who killed my family? If this were before the outbreak, I'd never be forced to interact with her. Nobody would ever even be in this situation. I knew life was never fair, but this was bullshit.
It's just...
He sighed, hesitant to be putting himself in the middle of this.
You knew her before. You know she's not that person. She's not a bad guy.
You don't know how bad I wish I could believe that, Blake. I told him, setting my elbows on my knees and propping my head up in my hands. That was the truth. I wanted to believe it. But it took a certain person to be capable of doing the things that Raiders did. And Echo had proved herself more than capable. But you don't understand how much it hurts just to be around her. Every time I look at her, all I can think is that it's her fault that they aren't with me.
She wasn't the only one there,
he offered. But she's the only one here. I looked up at him to see if he even understood, just a little, and whether he did or not, he nodded. It's so much easier to be angry all of the time than it is to be hurt. And you want to know something? I took a deep breath, not really bothering to wait for him to give confirmation. Lately, both of those just get so exhausting, and I can't feel anything, and it scares me. I could feel his hazel eyes on me, taking it in, thinking about what to say.
It doesn't help at all, knowing how bad she feels.
Sometimes it does, I told him honestly. For a little bit. When she'd make me forget about the raider. When she was just the girl from high school. But it never lasted. But I don't know how I'm supposed to forgive her. And don't tell me you honestly believe that I should be able to get over it. He shook his head to let me know that he didn't think that.
It just sucks. I'm used to being able to cheer you up just by making a cute face at you.
At that, he gave me a playful nudge, and I couldn't help but smile a little. It's the thought that counts, I said, nudging him back with my shoulders. He chuckled, seemingly happy that he managed to somewhat lift my spirits. I did feel a little better, not as mad as I had been. Really, it was just that apathy sinking in.
You want me to stick around?
Blake asked. It's okay, I answered, feeling like I wanted to be alone. You're watching her though, right? He knew I was talking about Echo, because he nodded as he stood and headed toward the door.
She's been sitting outside with me and Casey.
After I gave him a grateful smile, he ducked out, and I lay back on my cot to rest, the picture still in my hand. Stretching out like this, I could feel that my chest was bruised where Echo had hit me, and after about 15 minutes of massaging it, it had almost led me into a daze. I was in such a calm state that it hardly even bothered me when Echo walked in and sat on my cot, right next to where I was laying. My eyes were half closed, sleepily, but I felt so laid back, I just watched her, waiting for her to say something. She wasn't facing me. She was sitting on the edge, with her hands on her knees, staring across the tent at her own bed.
I shouldn't have said those things to you,
she said eventually, still without looking at or facing me, and instead she glanced down at her hands.
It was wrong and cruel, and I was out of line.
It seemed in her apology she'd purposely avoided saying the word sorry, like she knew it would make me upset. I remember what they look like, I told her, somewhat indignantly, as I reached around her with a hand that was holding the picture, and she flinched when I dropped my arm into her lap. Her gaze immediately shot back to the opposite side of the tent, where she couldn't see the photo. You can't even look at it, I asked flatly. She didn't respond, so I lifted my arm in order to drop it into her lap again. Look at it, I instructed. Echo took a deep breath before hesitatingly dropping her gaze to the photo. After she'd taken it in, her gray eyes followed my arm up to my face. And when they met mine, they were moist. There was so much genuine pain in that glance, pain worse than what I'd been feeling all day, that there was a little part of me that felt guilty for making her look at the picture. It caused me to pull my arm away. That way she wouldn't have to see it anymore.
I'm glad you remember,
she said, after the minute it took to blink away the tears.
I can't.
I didn't know what to say. And when I gave no reply, she looked at me again, as if to discover whether or not I was mad at her yet. But this wasn't the raider. And then there was the fact that ever since Blake had told me about what really happened to Echo's family. I'd made it something that was off limits to pick at her about. No matter what she'd done to me, bringing them up and making her feel guilty about it was wrong. I swore never to do it again, no matter how badly I wanted to hurt her.
Do you ever dream about them?
I shook my head.
That's the only time I get to remember.
All I could see was Echo's profile, but I couldn't miss the tear that ran down her cheek. In response, and because of how she was acting right now, because of who I felt I was talking to, I reached around her again, and this time I put my hand on her thigh in an attempt to be comforting. It seemed like it was a thoughtless instinct, but once I did, her hand immediately landed on top of it. She didn't seem to notice she'd even done it, since she was preoccupied at the same time with sighing.
But it fades so fast.
Then her thumb caressed the tops of my fingers, and her gaze lowered as if feeling it for the first time. She pulled her hand away, and clearing her throat rapidly stood. Echo's delayed reaction to my offer of consolation struck me as odd, and I could have sworn her cheeks tinted a shade of red. That was it, though. Just that sudden shift through something of a rejection of my comfort, and the girl that I used to know was gone. Like always, the shift caused a prompt change in my mood, and I was ready to be alone again.
Anyway,
she started, uncomfortably, turning just enough to look at me, and her eyes darted briefly toward my hand.
I just wanted to tell you that I was wrong.
Okay, I responded impatiently, folding my hands behind my head. Her face twisted in confusion at my change of disposition, like maybe she thought just moments ago that she'd made actual progress with me. But she'd never make real progress with how I felt about her, and now I regretted being nice even for a second.
Okay,
she repeated with a sigh, and then she was gone out of the entrance of the tent. I sort of just stared at the flap door after she disappeared, feeling entirely weird about how that whole conversation had gone, wondering why Echo had acted so awkward, and I hated that I was even curious. Chapter 17. Punishment Called Life. Echo.
Have you seen my gun? I asked Valerie as I hurriedly dug through my backpack, then got down on my knees to check under the velvety red seats. Our group was staying at a movie theater now, which was nice, since, even though we were stuck in the heart of the city, the walls were pretty soundproof.
Where are you going?
Valerie asked curiously, picking up a piece of clothing to check beneath it. Finding it there, she grabbed the pistol and began to stride over to hand it to me. I reached out for it as I answered. On a raid, Miles spotted a group. She handed the weapon over, but I could tell that it was reluctantly, and a moment later, she gave me a slight protest.
We were supposed to meet soon.
Can we do it tomorrow? I asked, glancing over her shoulder toward the exit, knowing the others were probably heading out the door already.
What about your hip?
She asked, pointing to where I'd been stabbed. It was recent, but if I was healed enough for sex, then I was healed enough to go on a raid. It seemed more like she was trying to find an excuse. It's a big group, I justified. They need me. I made a move for the center aisle. She stepped in my way.
Is Victor making you go?
No, I answered. And when my stomach rumbled violently, I impatiently looked toward the door again.
Leon?
She asked, and I shook my head, growing slightly irritated by her interrogation.
You volunteered?
I nodded, instantly seeing her mouth turn down in dissatisfaction. At first, I just thought that she was upset we wouldn't be meeting. But then I caught the real emotion behind the look. Hold on, I said in shock. It sounds like you're judging me. She folded her arms over her chest defiantly.
That's because I am.
Wow, I chuckled. But it wasn't in amusement. It was offended disbelief. I never figured you for a hypocrite. When she just shrugged, I held out my hands angrily, frustrated that she was doing this to me now, when time was limited. We've been on tons of raids together.
Yeah, but you hate going,
she said, stepping in the way when I tried to bypass her again.
You've never volunteered to go. Ever.
I haven't had a solid meal in over 2 weeks, Val. My voice was rising, my frustration with Valerie, and my offense at her judgment for being aggravated by my severe hunger. I'm starving.
That's not supposed to matter to you,
she hollered pleadingly. And I don't know why, but this was so upsetting to her that her eyes were watery. What the hell does that mean? I asked in confusion.
You're not like them, Echo,
she said, begging me softly now.
You're one of the last good people in the world. You're supposed to be the one person that hunger and violence don't affect, because you're better than that. Don't prove me wrong.
Valerie, I sighed. I'm not just hungry. I'm starving. I feel weaker every day. And I know you do too. This is survival. A tear slid down her cheek, but she made no move to let me pass. Please, Val, move. She lowered her gaze and shook her head. You'd rather we starve to death than let me go out in one simple raid. When she offered no response, my frustration swelled again. Move! I was determined to go on this raid. Determined to make sure that part of the spoils were ours. Because it was first come, first serve. And the burning in my stomach wouldn't let me think about anything else. Couldn't she see I was doing this for her? Move! I shouted angrily. This wasn't me. It was the hunger talking, yelling, but I couldn't control it.
No,
she said quietly, flinching when I threw my hands up angrily. She stood there like it was so easy for her to ask me this. But in the tense silence, I heard her stomach rumble, betraying her indifference to the hunger. I know you're hungry, I told her in annoyance, hoping it would get her to finally move. I'd have said or done anything to get some food. I'm doing this for you.
Don't do that. Don't make this about me,
she spat as if I'd offended her.
I won't be your excuse.
I'm going on this raid, I growled, my voice rising again. I'm gonna get something to eat. Now move.
No,
she yelled, eyes narrowing at me. God damn it, why do you care so much? I hollered desperately, unable to comprehend in my exhausted state why she would choose this over sustenance.
I think I love you,
she whispered, while another tear fell from her eye. That snapped me out of it enough that I straightened out of my furious pose, and I blinked at her a couple of times in shock. I opened my mouth, unsure even if anything would come out, but she interrupted before I could try.
Don't say it back. I know you don't love me.
It was true. I didn't love her. I cared about her more than anyone that was left on this godforsaken planet. But it wasn't love. Nor would I have thought that she felt that way about me. I'd always just figured that we were all each other had left. We were convenient, available, a needed companion in a lonely apocalypse. If it weren't for the outbreak, we never would have met. And she never would have been the kind of girl that I'd taken an interest in. As much as I hated to say it, and as much as it made me feel like a hypocrite, she wasn't strong enough. She let the guys bully her and wouldn't accept my help. She wouldn't even use a real weapon, except for that stupid wrench. This was the first time I'd ever even heard her raise her voice. "Why'd you say it then?" I asked, still thrown and unsure of how to respond. "Because," she answered, finally pushing past me to grab her backpack off the floor. "If I mean anything to you, you won't go on that raid." She started for the door, but turned back one last time. "I'll be at our normal spot. If you go with them," and she looked away like she couldn't say it to my face, "then I hope you know you deserve that tattoo." She ran out of the door before I could try and stop her. "Argh!" I shouted furiously the second she was gone, turning to my side and kicking the fold-up seat of the red theater chair. Once the seat stopped rattling, I sat down and put my hands to my head. The frustration, along with the cramping pain in my stomach, made my eyes well with tears. I hated the tattoo, just like I hated going on raids. But I was desperate. This wasn't the first time we'd gone hungry like this. But food was getting so scarce that it was the first time I was happy to go on a trip that I hated. I sat there for at least 10 minutes, thinking about it, though I was sure part of my starvation had something to do with my slow thought process. Despite the torment, I knew Valerie was right, and so I instantly stood and hurried after her. I strode through the dark city as quickly as I could, without rushing unsafely. But for some reason, there were a couple of biters roaming around, when usually I could go out without encountering a single one. It slowed me down considerably, and added at least 5 extra minutes to my walk. Eventually, I was nearing the alley I always met Valerie at, and I stopped in my tracks when I got close enough. There were noises, biter noises, and a scuffle. Then before I could even sprint forward to help Valerie if she needed, everything went silent. Now I sprinted, not caring if I made a sound, and when I reached the entrance of the alley, I could barely see her, bending over and using the wall for support as she lowered herself to the ground. "Val," I whispered, rushing forward and kneeling at her side. "You came," she smiled, but her voice sounded forced. "I came," I assured her, as I pulled out my flashlight and shined it down on her. "Oh God," I whimpered at her blood-covered body. There were biters lying around. She'd killed them all, or at least knocked them out with her wrench. But not all of the blood was from the biters. I knew that because when I touched her stomach, some oozed out over my hand, and she had more than one bite mark on her bare arms. "Val," I whined, tears filling my eyes. Through the blurry water in them, I glanced at the gash in her stomach again. It wasn't a bite mark or a scratch. It looked like a knife wound. "What happened?" I asked, frantically applying pressure to it to try and stop the bleeding. "It's okay. Listen," she said through a cough, ignoring my question. "I didn't mean what I said. I'm sorry. You're not like them. You'll never be like them." I didn't like the way that she was apologizing, like she had to because she knew it was over. It made me unable to contain the tears anymore, and I wiped the flow away with the back of my blood-stained hand. "Don't apologize, okay? Let's go. I'll get you fixed up at the theater." I tried to lift her off of the ground, but she gave a pained whine and stopped me. "Let me have your knife." I gave it to her, and she pushed it back into my hand. "You have to do something for me." "Stop it." I knew immediately what she wanted. and I shook my head as more tears streamed down my dirty cheeks. "You're gonna be fine," I cried. And then, like she was punishing me, I begged, "Please don't do this. I'm so sorry I yelled at you. I'll do better. Please, Val." I wouldn't ever yell at her again. I could try to love her. "You have to. I got bit. Promise me," she said weakly. And after looking at my face, her own eyes filled with water. "I'm too scared to do it myself." "I can't do it," I pleaded, clumsily holding the knife, while I tried once more to apply pressure to her stomach wound. "Promise me," she repeated sternly. I could see that she wasn't going to change her mind about it, and she wouldn't be able to do it herself. But even though I didn't think I could do it, I couldn't just leave her here. Not so that she could bleed to death slowly. Not so that she could turn into a biter. As much as it killed me, I nodded. "I promise." I buried my face against her neck, desperately trying to get as much time with her as I could. But I could feel her gulping air in shallow breaths, and her skin was already burning with a fiery fever. "Echo," she whispered, and when I looked at her, she asked, "What's your real name?" 4 years, and nobody in the group except for Leon knew it, not even Val. But she deserved to know, and when I told it to her, she grinned, letting out a happy huff of breath, even though it sounded painful. "I like it better." And she took my hands away from her stomach to hold them in her own. "You've done things, and you're gonna have to keep doing things." And she used one of her fingers to point at my chest. "You keep her here. You'll get out of here someday, and when you do, you won't have to be Echo anymore." I nodded, but she didn't seem satisfied. "Keep her safe," she said seriously. "I will," I assured her eagerly, and a moment later she moved my hand with the knife toward her heart. I was about to protest, but in the moment it took me to let out a sob, she gave me a look that reminded me I'd promised. I nodded to let her know I'd do it, and with a fond smile, she raised one hand to cup my face. Shutting my eyes tight to squeeze out the tears, I leveled the pointed blade to her heart, and then, trying not to think about exactly what I was doing, I gave it one hard push. Valerie's eyebrows shifted with the slightest cringe of pain, but it was clear she was trying so hard for me not to let it show. However, I already regretted it, and my mind was instantly flooded with thoughts that she could have made it. She could have survived the knife wound and fought the infection. In a moment of panic, I pulled the blade out, grabbing her hand with one of mine, while my other dropped the knife and pulled her head to my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Val." I hugged her to me, and I felt a weak arm go around my waist. The guilt was overwhelming. Maybe if I'd come sooner. Maybe if I'd asked her to just stay at the theater with me. "Don't go. I'm so sorry. I could love her. We could leave together. I didn't want to be alone. Please." A moment later, she went limp in my arms. And through sob after sob, I apologized again and again. "Echo." The voice startled me, and I fell onto my backside as I swiveled around to face it. "Victor," I said, wiping a tear off my cheek, only to have it replaced by another. "You scared me." He ignored my surprise and stayed standing near the entrance of the alley. "I always knew there was something between you two." My heart dropped. The knife wound. "What did you do?" I asked accusingly. I pulled out all the stops for you, Echo, he continued. I knew you were fucking her. Did you do this? I asked, my despair being increasingly replaced by a blindingly bitter rage. I forced myself onto my feet and pulled the pistol out of the back of my pants. What did you do, Victor? I asked fiercely. I did what I had to do, you little slut, he growled. He'd hardly finished his sentence when a loud bang clapped through the air, and I lowered my gun as he dropped to one knee. He had his hands over his other leg, holding the seeping bullet hole I'd put in his thigh. Echo, he said in shock as I bent over to grab my pocket knife. When I had it in my pocket, I reached for Valerie's backpack, because I knew she always had rope in it. Victor had stood to start agonizingly making his way to me, and I let him get close enough that I was sure not to miss, as I put another bullet through the same leg. Fuck! After I slung the rope over my shoulder, I picked up Valerie's wrench and strode over to Victor. Right as I reached him, he was trying to pull his own gun out of his jeans, but before he managed, I hit the side of his head with the wrench, just hard enough so that it wouldn't knock him unconscious. I grabbed his weapon and tossed it away, and then I aimed my own at him again. Get up, you worthless piece of shit, I commanded. This wasn't Echo anymore. This was something worse. He struggled to stand, but once he had, I pushed him toward the entrance of the alley. I was sure there were biters on the way, because of the gunshots, and now I was feeling pressured for time. Hurry up, I ordered, pushing him again and almost causing him to stumble over his injured leg. I forced him out to the alley and a few feet to the nearest street lamp, and then I smashed my fist over the holes in his thigh to make him fall again. When he dropped to his knees, I pushed him back against the pole, and I hit him in the head once more with the butt of my gun, just so that he wouldn't struggle. I pulled the rope off of my shoulder and yanked his arms behind the pole, and then I wrapped it tight around his wrist, locking him to the metal. A couple jerks at the bindings confirmed that they wouldn't come undone, and then I strode around to the front. You won't leave me here, he challenged, with a pained grimace. In response, I pulled the pocket knife from my pants and flipped it open in front of his face. Echo, he pleaded, at seeing how serious I was. Don't leave me here. Instead of saying anything, I used my knife to cut open the front of his t-shirt, exposing his bare chest. I didn't hesitate to dig the blade diagonally through his skin. Didn't hesitate when his blood mixed over my hands with Valerie's, or when it made him scream. Didn't hesitate to do it again the other way, to form a crimson X. I wouldn't be so loud if I were you, I told him coldly, just to rub it in, to taunt him, and he quieted his whimpers to look at me as I stood. I already see some biters coming. That was the truth. There were a couple sprinting down the street toward us. And without saying another word to Victor, I slipped into the shadows. He'd be enough of a distraction that I didn't think any of them would come after me. I was right. None of them did. And even from a block away, I could hear him scream. I could only stand it for a second, and then I started sprinting, trying to get as far as I could, so I wouldn't have to hear it anymore. Running like that, it didn't take long for me to reach the theater, and when I walked in, everyone was already back from the raid. Food, someone shouted to me from the concession stand. A volunteer to share was something new, but I wasn't even hungry anymore. Echo, Decker said as I passed the counter. Whose blood is that? I stopped walking and looked down at myself. It was all over me. My clothes, my arms, and surely my face. Valerie, I whispered. Some of it was Victor's, I thought. He chuckled. About time that dyke kicked the bucket. My face burned instantly with replenished fury, and in the split second it took me to calculate what I could threaten Decker with so that he'd take me completely serious, I stormed over, grabbing so fiercely between his legs and squeezing so relentlessly hard there were tears in his eyes. I could see one of the guys start over to come to his aid, so I pulled out my pistol and pointed it at him to warn him otherwise. If I ever hear you say that goddamn word again, I told Decker, taking satisfaction in the agonized red hue of his face, and I'll cut these off in your sleep. You understand? He nodded, and I shoved away from him to rush to the bathroom. When I got there, I hurried to the sink and pulled a water bottle out of my backpack. A brief look in the mirror showed me just how covered in blood I was. Mostly my shirt and my arms, but there was plenty on my face, and upon seeing it, fresh tears made muddy stripes down my cheeks. I wasn't going to bother trying to clean my shirt, and I pulled it over my head and threw it into the garbage. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely unscrew the cap of the bottle, and it didn't help that my eyes were so blurred with tears I could hardly see. When I did manage it, I dropped it in the sink, spilling some of its contents down the drain. Frustrated and panicked and scared, I growled and I threw my fist at the mirror. Instead of shattering it, my hand made a web of cracks in the glass. But I had so much more emotion to let out, so I turned on the stall wall beside me, pounding my arms and sliced knuckles against the metal until I was so tired my chest was heaving and the pain was too much. Valerie was dead. The only person I had in this world was gone. And why? Because of Victor. Because of one possessive, delusional asshole. But what I did to him was wrong. God, it was so wrong. I could still hear him screaming. Still feel my knife cutting into his chest. Into Val's chest. I wanted to take it all back. I wanted to go back there and untie him. But it was too late. He was dead, and I killed him. I deserved the tattoo. When I could barely breathe through exhaustion and sobs, I collapsed over the sink, using it to support myself so I wouldn't fall to the floor. After a minute, I recovered enough to look up into the broken mirror. The frighteningly blood-stained face there was unrecognizable. It wasn't me. Who are you? Are you ready? Genevieve asked, poking her head into the tent. I'd only half heard her since I'd been napping, so she spoke a little louder. Echo, we're ready to leave. I pushed myself up tiredly, glancing over at her, and wondering how she was even standing. We'd had night patrols last night, and during our ground shift, we'd stumbled across a few more ferals. Nobody got hurt, but Genevieve was so disconcerted by it that she'd continued patrolling the borders of camp all day. I'd stuck with her as long as possible, but a couple hours ago, I'd been about ready to collapse, so she'd let me come back for sleep while she pressed on with another of the soldiers. Now that the sun would be setting soon, it was time to leave for our supply run. A shiver traveled down my spine once I pushed my blankets off, and while I slipped into my boots, I looked at Genevieve again. She appeared exhausted, like if I took any longer to get ready, she'd sit on her cot, because standing up took too much effort. And if she sat down, I was pretty sure she wouldn't have the energy to get back up. How'd it go? I asked, trying to help get her mind off of how tired she was, while she waited for me. She'd been staring at the floor, but at my question, her eyes wandered to me, and she blinked slowly. It was okay, she answered. watching as I pulled on my dark green winter coat and then shoved my gloves into my backpack. It wasn't snowing yet, but it was cold enough to start, and I wouldn't be surprised if we had some within the week.
We didn't find any more ferals.
I opened the lid to the trunk near Genevieve's cot, pulled my pistol out, and checked the amount of ammunition in my magazine. That's good news, I suggested, shoving the weapon into the back of my pants, and then motioning to her that I was ready.
Oh,
she said as she remembered something, and before leading the way out, she took her backpack off to pull something out of it.
I found this in the armory.
She handed the item to me and returned her backpack to her shoulders. It was a thigh holster for my pistol, one that fit perfectly around my leg. Thanks, I told her while I buckled it and put my gun into it, genuinely surprised she'd thought of bringing it for me. We match, I mused with a laugh, pointing to the knife sheath around her thigh. She smiled amusedly, and then gave a tired nod and turned to leave. The moment I stepped outside the tent, I realized the air had gotten about 15 degrees colder since I'd laid down for a nap. So I pulled the fur-lined collar of my jacket up around my neck. Genevieve noticed the action, which seemed to remind her of the cold, because she pulled on the hood of her gray sweater she had underneath her brown leather coat, and she shoved her own hands into the pockets of it.
We have to do something about these ferals,
she said, her breath coming out of frosty fog in the icy air. Even though she seemed to be in a decent mood, and I usually like to talk to her during those times, the only acknowledgement I gave was a nod of agreement, and I didn't say anything else as we strode to the vehicles. I'd never been around her on so limited sleep, and I was a little bit afraid that her temper might be a bit shorter than usual if I got too comfortable. At the motor pool, we got into the lead striker with Blake, Kellen, Garcia, and Jarvis, and before I knew it, we were on our way. It was hardly 10 minutes into the drive that Genevieve started slumping over in her seat at the computers, and once or twice, I saw her head drop as though she'd fallen asleep. The third time, she stood, motioning for Blake to take command for her, while she trudged to the empty spot beside me. She immediately folded her arms over her chest and slouched down enough to kick her feet up on the seat across from us. I was just glad that she was finally going to get some sleep, even if the drive was only a couple of hours. What felt like only minutes later, we hit a bump in the road, and Genevieve must have already dozed off, because she fell sideways so that her head landed on my shoulder. I was afraid to move, not wanting to wake her or shift her, but I leaned forward just enough to look at her face. She was out like a light, and I couldn't help but let my lips curl into a fond smile. When I looked up again, I caught Kellen's eye from across the vehicle, and my smile instantly faded. There was a scowl on his face that he made no attempt to hide when I caught him looking at me. In fact, it deepened. It had been obvious from day one that he didn't like me, but it seemed as though his attraction to Genevieve made him even more resentful. I wasn't exactly sure if he was intelligent enough to have realized the way that I felt about her, but when he looked at me, especially like he was now, it was obvious he knew there was something different about it. Despite Kellen's expression, I didn't look away. I didn't want him thinking I was the type of person to be intimidated. Chiefly because in certain ways he reminded me of Decker. I wasn't going to take any shit from him. So I narrowed my eyes at him, and when in response his glare intensified, the grip he had on the rifle in his lap tightened simultaneously. That's when I looked away, because even though I had the urge to rest my head on top of Genevieve's, just to tease him, I still didn't know him well enough to know how easily provoked he'd be. I didn't make eye contact with him again the entire drive, and Genevieve didn't move a muscle until we got close to our destination, and the voices coming over the radio woke her. She shifted her head a little and took in a deep breath, like she was still waking up and wasn't sure exactly where she was. And she quickly lifted it up to look at me. And even in the dark of the vehicle, I could see her cheeks tint, like she was embarrassed she had been leaning on me. Instead of acknowledging me or continuing to act embarrassed, she straightened up in the seat a little bit and rested her head back. I noticed out of the corner of my eye that she shivered, and after folding her arms more tightly across her chest, I felt her start to lean into me again. Only this time it was so subtle, I wasn't sure she even knew she was doing it. Kellen noticed, though, and I'd underestimated the ferocity of his scowl. For a supply run, we had to drive the vehicles into the city, but fortunately the night seemed quiet, and as we pulled up, there wasn't a feral in sight. I jumped out right after Genevieve and stood with her near the exit while the rest of the soldiers gathered around. Kellen hopped out shortly after I did, and I knew it was on purpose when he bumped into me so hard I shouldered Genevieve. Genevieve shot me a dirty look out of annoyance that I'd knocked into her, and with a defensive groan, I motioned toward Kellen. She didn't seem to get it, or she didn't care, and when I turned to glare at Kellen, he had a smug grin on his face. Seeing as nobody was going to take my side on it, I decided to let it go. The first building we scavenged from was a large supermarket. Genevieve and I guarded the outside like we usually did, while the other 19 guys cleared out the inside. Once the inside was empty of ferals, Genevieve and I went back to help gather anything that would be of use back at camp. As I followed her down the aisles, it was clear there wasn't going to be very much food to find, but there were other supplies. I silently trailed Genevieve down the cleaning aisle, and while she used the red beam of her flashlight to gather some soap, I stopped at the batteries on the opposite end. I only managed to get a couple of packs into my bag before there was a soft thud, and when I glanced over, Genevieve was sprawled out on her back on the floor. There were no ferals around, nor anything I could see on the ground that she'd have tripped over, so I strode over to her with an entertained smile on my face. "And you think I'm the clumsy one," I whispered in amusement, but the moment I reached her, I figured out why she'd fallen. A bottle of liquid soap had been knocked off of the shelf, broken, and now the fluid was all over the tiled floor. Too bad I didn't figure it out soon enough, because I'd hardly finished teasing her when I slipped in it too. And of course, I landed right on top of her. Luckily, she didn't seem annoyed by it. She snorted with laughter.
"Dumbass,"
she chuckled quietly.
"Are you okay?"
Falling on top of Genevieve had saved the majority of my body from hurt, but I was still in so much pain I could barely answer. "I smacked my knee," I managed in a half grunt. "I need a second."
"I get that you're in pain,"
she murmured, and then her hands landed on my hips to give me a questioning push.
"But could you get off of me and then recover? My rifle's digging into my spine."
The moment she touched me, I completely forgot about the pain, and I pushed myself up a little to look at her.
"What?"
she asked, expectantly, gaining a bit of the annoyance I'd been expecting.
"You hit your head too?"
Was it weird that I wanted to kiss her? The urge felt weird, until when I failed to say anything, she sort of just stared at me. The annoyance disappeared from her eyes, and instead they wandered over every inch of my face, curiously, no doubt wondering what I was thinking. She no longer appeared impatient, or mad, or uncomfortable that I was so close. Maybe it was all in my head, but I could have sworn I even felt her thumb absent-mindedly stroke my hip. It was the worst idea I'd ever had in my life. I knew she hated me, and if I did it, then she'd probably, at the very least, smack me. But figuring how she hated me, what did I have to lose? Hell, maybe it would even confuse her enough that she'd stop acting like such a bitch all the time. I was about to go for it, but a deep, concerned voice carried down the aisle. "Genevieve?" It was Kellen. "Everything okay?" And then he appeared a few feet away from us. Genevieve must have been embarrassed about being found in the position we were in, because she didn't wait any longer for me to recover. "Get off," she mumbled impatiently, finally pushing against my hips hard enough to roll me off of her. I laid on the floor for another few seconds after she got up and walked away, to let the pain in my knee completely subside. Then I stood to find that Kellen was still there, glaring at me as fiercely as he had been in the vehicle. I tried to ignore him and continue on my way. The last thing that I wanted was any kind of altercation. But when I tried to pass him, he stepped in front of me. When he refused to move, I sighed and slowly lifted my gaze to his face. He didn't look like he was going to say anything to me. It appeared he was content trying to be intimidating. To let him know that I wasn't afraid of him, I smirked and whispered teasingly, "Jealousy's not a good look for you." His jaw clenched furiously as he stared me down, and I was just beginning to worry he might try something violent when he brushed past me and stomped off. Seeing as all I really wanted was to avoid Kellen, I was ready to let the whole thing go. The rest of the night, however, I discovered he wasn't so eager to do the same. It wasn't just the dirty looks I got the whole time either. Whenever he handed me a box of supplies that we'd gathered to load up in one of the vehicles, especially if it was a heavy one of building materials for cabins, he roughly dropped it into my arms. Twice I dropped the boxes, and he kicked an item away as I was picking it up. Every time he passed me, he bumped me, like he did exiting the striker. All of these while Genevieve had her back turned. I hated taking shit from him. The only reason I put up with it was for Genevieve, and he seemed to know it. We got back to camp at daybreak, and enough people were already stirring that there were volunteers to unload supplies instead of us having to do it. Casey was even up and waiting for Blake at the fire between our tents. I was glad to be back, where I could avoid Kellen, and I thought he'd get over being a jackass when we returned. But on his way to his own campsite, he tramped through ours, deliberately bumping into me one last time. I snapped. "Hey, asshole!" I barked before he got even 4 feet away. "Do we have a problem?" Blake and Casey had been hugging and greeting, and Genevieve had just entered the tent to set her backpack down. But when I said that, Blake and Casey looked over, and Genevieve poked her head out of the tent curiously. Kellen stopped in his tracks, turning back toward me with a pleased look on his face that let me know he'd been hoping for a reaction. "Do you want one?" he asked savagely, taking a step in my direction. I wasn't afraid of him. I was fairly certain he wouldn't pull his gun on me. So far, he didn't seem like that type. And I was almost positive I could kick his ass, even though he was at least 5 inches taller than me. "You want to hit me?" I asked in response to his advance, taking my own aggressive step forward. "Go ahead. The only person it's going to be a problem for is you." "You've got to be kidding me," Genevieve grumbled, moving between us and pushing me back. "Knock it off," she told me seriously. "What?" I asked, in disbelief. She was scolding me? "He's been harassing me all night." Kellen had that smug fucking grin on his face again, and it made me so mad that I tried to sidestep Genevieve to get at him. Genevieve just shoved me back again, harder this time. "Let her try something, LT," Kellen told her. And now that he was feeling the fire, I saw Blake start to come over. I'll beat that raider attitude right out of her. I tried to get past her again, and after pushing me away once more, she turned on my rival.
"Kellen,"
she said, pointing a furious finger at him.
"Walk away."
He opened his mouth to protest, but she cut him off with a fierce glare.
"That was not a request."
His eyes narrowed at me, but he turned the other direction, grumbling indignantly as he did. "Yes, ma'am." Once he was gone, Blake relaxed and sat with Casey near the already blazing fire, and Genevieve began to walk away. However, I was still so fired up that I yelled after her, "Hey!" She should have let me kick his ass. She turned to face me, looking completely unconcerned about what just happened.
"What?"
she asked boredly. I stammered, unsure of what to say since for once she actually looked prepared to listen to me. "I didn't start that," I told her, knowing how she loved to blame things on me.
"I know,"
she said, and then raised one eyebrow like she couldn't figure out what I was getting at. "Well, I was thrown." Did she know the whole night that he was trying to provoke me? Why didn't you make him stop?
"Do you want him to think I'm actually starting to like you?"
she asked rhetorically.
"How would that help?"
My eyebrows furrowed, and I couldn't help squinting at her in shock. Was she saying she'd knowingly done me a favor? She was right. Kellen already had the wrong idea about her and I, and if he thought Genevieve actually liked me, it would make things infinitely worse. But she hated me. Wouldn't she take satisfaction in Kellen being a jerk and want to make it worse? I mumbled, unconfident with how to respond to this. "Thanks?" I was expecting her to reply with, "You're welcome," or at least give my gratitude some sort of acknowledgement. Instead, she turned to go back to the tent, like we hadn't just had that conversation. All it did was confuse me even more. I trudged over to the fire. Still so baffled, I almost tripped because I was staring back toward the tent, and I plopped down across from Blake and Casey. "Are congratulations in order for making progress on the rival front?" Blake asked playfully as I sat down. My gaze slowly wandered to him, and then back to where Genevieve had disappeared. I honestly have no idea what to make of that. Chapter 18. Take a look. Dugan. "Chicken noodle soup or last can of SpaghettiOs?" I asked Kara, digging through our duffel bag of food. We'd wandered into a small city last night and crept our way to the roof. It was a little after noon now, as good a time as any for one of our 2 daily meals. Kara squinted thoughtfully at the cans I was now holding up, and then pointed her finger back and forth between the two like she was doing eeny, meeny, miny, mo in her head. "Chicken noodle," she answered eventually. I chuckled at her decision-making method and tossed her the food and the can opener. For myself, I pushed out a tin of mushy asparagus, seeing as Kara couldn't even swallow the vegetables. I couldn't say I blamed her, and it didn't bother me too much that she didn't eat the healthy stuff, seeing as there probably wasn't much nutritional value left in it anyway. "Okay," I said, continuing the game we'd been playing before pausing to choose food. "This one doesn't really have any words." After she nodded, I began whistling the tune. Kara was the same age as my daughter before the outbreak, and with a kid their age, the thing that was on television the majority of the time was cartoons. So for the past hour or so, we'd been playing a game where we sang the theme songs from cartoons, and the other guessed. It was a surprisingly difficult game since it was so long ago, And it was even harder for me because I didn't pay nearly enough attention when the TV was on as Kara would have.
"Oh,"
she exclaimed with recollection when I finished whistling, and she snapped her fingers as if they would help her guess.
"I know it,"
she whispered, and tossed me the can opener before slurping some of her soup.
Ed, and Eddie."
"Hey," I praised with a laugh. "Nice guess."
"I got one,"
Kara said with a grin.
"But it's really easy, so I'm only gonna say the first line."
I nodded for her to continue.
"Who lives in a pineapple under the sea?"
I burst into laughter. I could imagine the tune of the next line perfectly. But what was that yellow thing's name? Crap, I chuckled. This one was Christina's favorite. Give me a hint.
"He's a sponge,"
Kara told me flatly, looking shocked that I didn't know it right away. Sponge, I said slowly. It was coming to me. Bob Squarepants.
"You have a pretty good memory,"
she laughed. Years of this stuff makes it hard to forget. I shrugged and swallowed down a piece of asparagus. While we paused the game again to continue eating, a gust of wind worked its way under the collar of my jacket, causing me to shiver. It was still early in winter, but I'd underestimated how cold the desert could get, and I wouldn't be surprised if it actually started snowing in the colder months of January and February. It almost made me miss feral-infested Los Angeles, and it did make me reconsider when we should start cutting north. It might be safer to travel across the warmer southern states and then head up toward New York once we were closer to the East Coast and almost out of winter. As I pondered what our plan should be, I saw Kara cringe, but it didn't look like cold. It looked like pain. "You okay?" I asked concertedly.
"My stomach hurts,"
she replied, glancing into her can of soup.
"You think the food is bad?"
I scooted closer, and when she held it out to me, I took my own brief look into her can. It appeared fine, so I sniffed it. Smelled fine, too. "I don't know, but it looks okay." She cringed again and put her hand to her stomach while she whined.
"Ow."
"You backed up from all this canned crap?" I asked jokingly to try to make her feel better.
"I don't think so,"
she chuckled, but she set her food aside and stood up.
"Be right back."
She disappeared for a few minutes behind the structure that the roof access door was set in. When she came back, she didn't say anything, but she didn't sit down right away either. She sort of just stood there for a minute before saying anything.
"I'm bleeding."
"What do you mean?" I asked worriedly, standing up in case she was injured. "Are you okay?" She mumbled awkwardly, and her cheeks tinted.
"I don't know exactly."
She cringed again and pushed her hand into her stomach.
"My dad mentioned it one time, and said I should ask my uncle's girlfriend. All he said was, 'Don't come to me. You talk to Martha if you start bleeding from your lady.'"
Okay, I cut her off, waving my hands through the air frantically. Yeah, I got it."
"But Martha's not around, and I don't..."
She paused, her cheeks tinting a little darker at seeing how uncomfortable it made me.
"Am I sick?"
I sighed, glad my skin was too dark for her to tell how badly I was blushing. This was a conversation I never would have had with my own daughter. It would have been Patricia's job. But this poor kid had no idea what was going on. She even looked kind of scared, and I was the only one around. Kara was 15. Shouldn't this have been taken care of by now? "You're not sick. It's normal," I said reassuringly, and she made a disbelieving face that caused me to laugh. "None of them ever gave you anything for when it would happen?" I asked, trying to find the least dramatic way for both of us to go about this. She furrowed her eyebrows and glanced toward her backpack.
"Anything like what?"
I took that as a no. and strode to the edge of the roof to see how many ferals we'd have to avoid. I wasn't going to make the poor kid wait until nightfall to go searching for some hygiene products. But when I got to the edge of the roof and looked down at the street, I completely forgot about Kara's dilemma. "Hey, come here." I waved her over, and when she got to my side, I asked, "What do you see?" She leaned over the side to glance every direction.
"Nothing?"
she said questioningly. "Exactly," I mumbled, squinting in the distance. "Where are all the ferals?"
"Whoa,"
she whispered in shock, realizing it for the first time. There wasn't a single feral in sight. We were atop one of the tallest buildings in a small city. A few blocks of urbanized structures and a concrete shopping mall. The city was surrounded on every side with miles of empty desert. Isolated was an understatement. But there had to have been people here before the outbreak, right? Where'd they all go? Or if they'd been turned, what happened to the ferals? That explained why we'd had such an easy time getting to the roof of this building. I strode back to our stuff and picked up my rifle, and then carried it back to the edge. I peeked through the scope and scanned every corner of the city I could see from our roof. Other than flags and desert plants blowing in the breeze, there wasn't a single movement to be seen. No people, no animals, no ferals. It's like this place had been a ghost town for years. But that seemed impossible. "What the hell?" I said, lowering my rifle and then handing it to Kara so that she could look too.
"Do you think this town is safe?"
she asked, once she finished scanning with the scope. "Nowhere is safe," I answered seriously. When I met her gaze, I could tell exactly what question she was going to ask next. She wanted to go out and explore. I couldn't say I disagreed. And it wasn't just the mystery of what was going on here that was appealing. It was the prospect of getting to walk around a city during the day, something we hadn't been able to do in 6 whole years. "Let's go," I told her with a small smile. But as we went over to gather our things, I added, "Stay alert, though." She nodded compliantly, and we started back down towards the stairs and into the building. Kara held her axe at the ready, just like I did with my rifle, but we made it to the first floor without encountering anyone or anything. Even though it was pretty cold outside, it was such a beautiful day, standing there on the sidewalk under the main doors. One almost got the illusion it was a lazy Sunday pre-outbreak. But there were things that shattered the illusion. The stench of death that hovered in every city, letting me know that the ferals had been here at one point. The leftover cars on the road, their tires cracked and melted into the pavement. Their paint faded and peeling. I'm sure the grass that had been planted into the dirt pots around the city would have been overgrown if we weren't in a desert. But now they were just empty squares of dry, fractured dirt because no one was around to water them. "Stay close to the walls," I instructed, not ready to believe yet that we were completely alone. I figured the best destination to see if there were really no ferals here would be the shopping mall, so we started in that direction. The whole time I was keeping my eyes peeled for clues to what happened here, and as we passed by a sporting goods store, I saw something curious. All the cars that lined this side of the narrow road looked like they'd been pushed out of the way by something massive. And when I strode to the center of the street, I could see the paint along the sides of them had been scraped off. That's when something shiny beneath my feet caught my attention.
"What is it?"
Kara asked, coming over and kneeling at my side. I held the hollow piece of metal in my hand, while Kara picked one up too. "Bullet castings," I answered. "Massive. 50 caliber casings. And hundreds of them littered the streets. From a machine gun, maybe."
"A machine gun?"
Kara repeated in awe, and she strode over to run her fingers across the scraped side of a car.
What do you think did this?
I made my way to her to examine it more closely. In some spots, some of the cars were even dented or crushed. A tank? I offered unsurely. I was so baffled. What if it was a tank? What if it was the military? I'd been convinced all these years that the government had collapsed, that there was no military left, because almost everyone who tried to fight the ferals was dead. If they were starting to clear the world of infected, wouldn't they have somewhere for survivors to go? Wouldn't they try to leave some sign, some sort of directions for getting somewhere safe?
Like an army tank?
Kara asked.
You think soldiers were here?
I don't know, I told her honestly. It could have been soldiers, or it could have been anyone else who got their hands on military equipment. As I was answering, I'd been trudging back toward the sporting goods store, of which all of the front windows had been smashed. I stepped over the shattered window pane, glass crunching under my shoes as I strode in. It was a small store, but there was practically nothing of value left. The gun section, to the immediate left of the entrance, had been ransacked. There wasn't a single box of ammo left, no camping equipment, no food or first aid supplies, no portable butane tanks, nothing but rollerblades and baseball gloves.
Dugan,
Kara called from outside, and when I looked at her through the empty windows, she waved me over.
Look.
She pointed to the ground of the street, where I had to squint to see what she was motioning to. A trail of blood, or countless trails of blood, so dark and dried that they nearly blended with the black asphalt. But they were all streaked, leading the same direction. We followed it around the corner, where it joined more crimson trails to the sidewalk. They led to the alley between two brick buildings, and when we got to the entrance of it, I almost didn't believe my eyes. The entire alley was filled with black, charred skeletons, one after the other piled on top of each other to form a gruesome stack of bones, taller than I was. The stench was almost unbearable, but I pulled my jacket across my face to dull it some while I walked into the alley. When I got to the very edge of the pile, I held my hand an inch above a skeleton. It was cold, not a bit of warmth left over from the fire that had destroyed them, so I couldn't determine how recent it was. At least we knew this place was completely empty. I just hoped it was only feral bodies in this deadly alley.
You think that's every feral in the city?
Kara asked from the side at the bottom of the stack. Unless they missed one or two, I answered with a nod. It's gotta be.
Sweet,
she laughed happily. It was nice not to have to worry quite as much about ferals, but I wasn't completely convinced we were safe. Whoever had done this was capable of maximum casualties. Whether they were military or not, they were dangerous, and if they were still around, then I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to meet them. Something about it didn't feel right. Let's keep moving, I told Kara. We headed back toward the main road to follow it to the shopping mall. On the way there, we passed a convenience store, which I wanted to check out to get Kara the items she needed. I hadn't forgotten. So I opened the front door, and when it dinged a bell overhead, I cringed out of instinct. Kara cringed too, and she raised her fire axe to prepare for an onslaught of ferals. None came, but we still checked every corner of the shop to make sure it was completely clear. Okay, I murmured, scanning the shelves for what we needed. Spotting a package, I grabbed it and hastily put it into Kara's hands. Here. She turned it over with a confused look on her face.
What are these for?
I paused awkwardly. For your... And I motioned toward her body. You know. She opened the package and pulled out one of the smaller flat ones.
What do I do with it?
Jeez, kid, I sighed with exasperated discomfort. She didn't appear to have a clue that most men didn't like talking about it, though I swear I could see something of an amused smile at the way she was acting. I don't know what you do with it. And I risked getting closer to scan the package. Here, I pointed. There's directions. Her eyes wandered over to the printed instructions.
Okay,
She mumbled unsurely, and then glanced to the back of the store where the bathroom was. I'll wait here, I told her with an uncomfortable nod. She disappeared at the back of the store, so I occupied myself with browsing through the rest of the aisles. It appeared this small shop had been picked clean, too. All of the small boxes and bottles of medicine had been taken, along with any of the canned food that might have been on the shelves. Even the cigarettes, snuff, and dipping tobacco had been cleared out. Since there wasn't anything worth taking, I grabbed the lottery ticket from the counter and scratched at it with my nail. That one was a loser, but the next one would have gotten me $20 before the outbreak.
find anything?
Kara asked, coming through the aisle toward the front of the store. Nope, I answered as she reached me, and we turned for the entrance. We were both quiet for a few minutes, and after a while I got the feeling Kara didn't really know what to say to me. Then I started feeling bad, wondering if I should have sucked it up and offered more advice or explained better what was happening to her. I would have had to do it if she was my own daughter. Here goes nothing. It's going to happen once a month, I told her, and it seemed to take her a second to understand what I was talking about. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It just makes most guys uncomfortable. Usually the mom explains it. I shrugged, refusing to look at her, because I was blushing so bad now I was sure that she could see it. If you were my daughter, it would probably be accompanied by a sex talk and a rule about not dating until you're 40. Kara frowned her eyebrows.
Sex talk?
I felt all the blood drain from my face, and it must have shown because she started laughing.
That was a joke, Dugan.
She chuckled. You're the spawn of Satan, I grumbled teasingly. That's a dad's worst nightmare. If it was up to me, I would have banned boys forever.
My dad used to tell me that too,
She said, still giggling.
He'd say he had his shotgun loaded for it if the day ever came that I brought a boy to the house.
She shook her head amusedly.
I was only 8.
8, I chuckled knowingly. 30, it doesn't matter. You'd have been his baby girl forever.
It sounds like you were a really good dad,
Kara told me with a grin. Thanks, I replied gratefully, scanning the parking lot for dangers as we reached the mall. Your dad sounds like he was a good guy.
He was a lot of fun.
She nodded her agreement.
I think it's because he was pretty young when he had me. That's what my uncle used to say anyway. He was only 18 when I was born. We were always laughing together, and my uncle would just shake his head and say, "That's what happens when children have children."
That more than surprised me, seeing as whenever Kara talked about him, I got the impression he was older. If you ask me, I started, trying not to show my shock. He did a better job raising you than a lot of dads who were older than him. She gave me a thankful smile, but didn't say anything because we walked through the entrance of the mall, both of us raising our weapons expectantly. It was a pretty tiny mall, stretching out in 2 halls on both sides of us. I could see the end of each hall, even from the main doors. The escalators directly in front of us led to the second and final floor. Every single shop on the first floor was closed. The barred gates pulled down to block the entrances, and it would be no use trying to get through them. I nodded for Kara to follow me upstairs, and it was the same situation on the second floor. Every shop was barred, except one, even though I wouldn't necessarily call it a store. It was an arcade, lit up on the inside because it wrapped around to take up 2 corners, and the entire of its walls were glass. When I saw what occupied the majority of the back of the arcade, I got a giddy spark of excitement. You ever play putt-putt? I asked Kara, leading the way to the employee counter to grab 2 putters and golf balls. She looked confused, so I clarified. Miniature golf.
Once,
she answered, taking the putter I was handing her with a laugh.
a long, long time ago.
She trailed me to the first hole, watching as I set my ball down.
We're really doing this?
I used to love golf, and that included miniature golf on the weekends Christina wanted to go. We've been on the road for weeks now. I think we deserve a break.
Sounds good to me,
Kara agreed cheerfully, and motioned for me to continue with my first shot. We played 2 rounds of mini-golf before figuring we should search the city some more before nightfall. As nice as it was to be able to relax for the first time in a while, we couldn't stay here. It was a possibility that whoever killed all the ferals might come back, and it was a possibility that they weren't friendly. The camp Kara heard about was our end goal, and I wanted to get there as quickly as possible. So we left the mall about 2 hours before sunset, and roamed parts of the small city for any stores that hadn't been ransacked. It wasn't until we reached a point furthest from our original hideout and the machine gun casings that I stopped our search. As we were passing by a house, something caught my eye. A movement, the slightest flutter of the curtain from inside. I'd stopped to stare as Kara continued on, but when she realized I was no longer with her, she backtracked.
What's up?
I thought I saw something, I told her, pointing up to the second floor of the house where I'd seen the movement. Then I heard something. Listen. A faint but repetitive thump from inside the house, followed by the sound of a feral, and a very human voice screaming help. Get your shotgun out, I said, hastily moving to the front door of the house.
Dugan,
Kara protested lightly, but she was already retrieving her shotgun from the straps of her backpack. There's somebody in there. I didn't waste a moment in kicking my foot flat against the door to break it open, but it was bolted so securely that I bounced off of it. The axe, I requested, rushing to Kara to get it, and then hurrying back to the door. I smashed the blade into the wooden door repeatedly, throwing away precious moments in trying to help the person. Eventually, I smashed a hole large enough to fit my arm through, and I made sure that there were no ferals right inside so they wouldn't bite me as I stuck my hand through and twisted the locks. Hey! I yelled as the door swung open, trying to lure the ferals away from whoever was inside. I could hear them on the second floor, but if any of them had heard me, they weren't interested. Since they weren't coming to me, I had to go to them, and I heard Kara's footsteps behind me as I ran into the house and up the stairs. I sprinted to a bedroom on the second floor where the noise was coming from. There were only 3 live ferals and 2 more dead ones across the room. There wasn't a moment's pause between when I first stepped foot in the room and when I crossed it with Kara's axe in hand. They were eating a man alive. I swung it hard at the back of the first feral on top of the struggling man. When I hit it, another one that had its mouth clamped over the man's neck released him to rear up and roar at me. A loud blast of multiple holes through its chest, and a final swing at the axe buried the blade deep in the skull of the final feral. I glanced down at the man. He was bleeding profusely, gurgling from a terminal wound in his neck. He'd bled out before he even had a chance to turn. We got here too late, but it didn't make any sense. Why was he locked in this house, with the last remaining ferals in the entire city? Did you kill all those ferals? I knelt at his side, keeping some distance because I was wary of his tainted blood. I knew it was probably wrong to question a dying man, but something was so wrong about this situation. Despite the fact that he was already pale with the loss of blood, he began to push himself up, coughing painfully through the wound on his neck as he scooted to lean back against the bed. He coughed again, spitting blood to his side like he was frustrated it cut him off. They locked me in here with... cough. Them. I tried to... He spat again and grunted with agony. when he pressed his hand to his neck wound to try to slow the bleeding. "Run out when I saw you." When he finished his short explanation, he leaned his head back and coughed some more. "Who locked you in here?" I asked. He took a weak, raspy breath. "Dressed like soldiers," he whispered with difficulty. I could tell that he only had a few words left in him. "Not soldiers. Used me as bait. Don't..." Only half of another weak breath. "Don't trust them." I looked over at Kara, and she stared right back at me wide-eyed. They used this man as bait for the ferals. They were far more dangerous than I thought. "We're getting the hell out of here,"